In the quiet dust of modern Iraq, a single, colossal arch looms against the sky. It is all that remains of the Tak Kasra, the throne hall of a lost empire. Wind whispers through its empty spaces, the same wind that once cooled the brows of the Sasanian Shahs, the king of kings. Their empire, a civilization stretching back 1,000 years through its Parthian and Achaemenid ancestors, was the equal of Rome. Its armies were clad in intricate steel. Its cities were jewels of art and learning. And its faith, Zoroastrianism, was one of the world's great ancient religions. And then, in the span of a single generation, it was gone, wiped from the political map so completely, it seems almost a strange dream. How does a superpower, a name that commanded fear and respect from Constantinople to the Indus, simply vanish? How does its ancient fire-worshipping faith get buried so deep that only embers remain? The story of medieval Iran begins not with a birth, but with a spectacular death, a collapse so sudden and so total, it still echoes with mystery. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. Now, let the world outside fade away, and let's travel back to the twilight of an empire. Our story begins in a place of deceptive glory. The early 7th century saw the Sasanian Persian Empire at its absolute zenith under Shah Khosrow II. He was a monarch of almost mythical wealth, ruling from his magnificent capital at Ctesiphon, a sprawling metropolis on the banks of the Tigris. His palaces were draped in silks woven with gold thread. His tables overflowed with delicacies, and his authority was, in theory, absolute. He had even, in a stunning series of victories, brought the Sasanian Empire's ancient enemy, the Byzantine Roman Empire, to its knees. His armies had conquered Syria, Palestine, and even Egypt. In 614, they captured Jerusalem itself and carried away its most sacred relic, the true cross, as a trophy. It felt, to anyone living at the time, like the final, decisive victory in a rivalry that had lasted for centuries. The world was Persian, but this triumph was a poisoned chalice. The war had lasted for over 2 decades, a grinding, all-consuming conflict that we might now call a world war. It had drained the treasuries of both empires, emptied their villages of young men, and ravaged the farmlands that fed them. Khosrow, blinded by his success, had become tyrannical and paranoid. He'd alienated the great noble families who formed the backbone of his army, and rejected peace overtures from the desperate Byzantine emperor, Heraclius. And then, in a reversal of fortune worthy of a Greek tragedy, Heraclius, against all odds, launched a daring counter-invasion. He didn't just reclaim his lost lands, he struck deep into the Persian heartland itself, marching his armies to the very gates of Ctesiphon. The invincible Shah was suddenly vulnerable, and his disgruntled nobles saw their chance. In 628, Khosrow II was overthrown and executed by his own son. What followed was not stability, but pure, unadulterated chaos. The murder of the king shattered the mystique of the monarchy. In the next 4 years, Iran saw at least a dozen different rulers, generals, noblewomen, usurpers, and children, each claiming the throne, none able to hold it. It was a game of musical thrones, where the music kept stopping every few months, usually accompanied by the sound of an assassin's blade. This period of intense civil war was the final hammer blow to the empire's structure. The centralized bureaucracy fell apart, irrigation canals fell into disrepair, and a devastating plague swept through the western provinces, killing a huge portion of the population. The once mighty empire was sick, exhausted, and bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. It was into this power vacuum that a new, entirely unexpected force emerged from the south, from the deserts of Arabia. They were Arabs, united for the first time by the new faith of Islam. At first, the Persian commanders on the frontier barely registered the threat. These were just desert raiders, a nuisance to be swatted away. But the raids grew larger, more organized, and more daring. The Arab warriors were driven by a fervent belief and a tactical brilliance that the lumbering, hierarchical Sasanian army simply couldn't comprehend. Historians still argue whether the empire was a hollowed-out tree, just waiting for a strong wind, or if the wind that arrived from the desert was a storm of unique and irresistible force. The decisive moment came in 636 at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, a multi-day clash in the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. The Sasanian general, Rostam Farrokhzad, a veteran of the old wars, knew the empire was in peril. He assembled a vast, magnificent army, a glittering spectacle of the old world. Thousands of heavily armored cataphracts, the elite cavalry, sat astride their great war horses. Behind them stood ranks upon ranks of infantry, and most terrifyingly, a contingent of war elephants, the tanks of their day. Facing them was a smaller, more lightly armed Arab force. It should have been a slaughter, but Rostam was plagued by doubt, understanding if the legends are true. A sense of foreboding. The battle raged for days. On the third day, a blinding sandstorm kicked up, blowing directly into the faces of the Persians, hampering their archers and terrifying their elephants. In the chaos, the Arab warriors pressed their advantage, and in the swirling dust and confusion, Rostam himself was slain. His death broke the army's spirit. The imperial banner fell, and the retreat turned into a rout. The path to the capital, Ctesiphon, was now wide open. When the Arab army arrived, they were stunned. They were men of the desert, accustomed to a life of austerity. They wandered through palaces filled with treasures beyond their wildest imaginings, famously mistaking blocks of camphor for salt and trying to cook with it. The entire imperial treasury, the accumulated wealth of centuries, fell in a single day. The heart of the empire had been torn out. The new Shah, a young boy named Yazdegerd III, who had been placed on the throne amidst the chaos, fled east across the Zagros Mountains, a king without a kingdom. He tried to rally one last great army at Nahavand in 642, but this too was crushed. After that, organized resistance collapsed. The great cities of the Iranian plateau, Isfahan, Rai, Hamadan, fell one by one, and Yazdegerd, the last heir of Khosrow, spent the final years of his life as a hunted fugitive, begging for help from local governors and even the distant emperor of China, until he was ignominiously murdered by a miller near Merv in 651. His dynasty and his world turned to dust. The death of the fugitive king, Yazdegerd III, in a dusty miller's hut in the far northeast, was more than just the end of a man. It was the end of an idea. For a decade, while he lived, the dream of repelling the invaders and restoring the throne of Iran had flickered, however faintly. But with his pathetic demise, that flame was extinguished. The conquest was no longer a temporary disaster. It was a permanent reality. The house of Sasan was gone, and the vast Iranian plateau, from the mountains of the Zakros to the plains of Central Asia, now answered to a new authority, the Caliph of the Muslims, ruling from Medina, and soon from Damascus. The question on every Persian's mind, from the high-born nobleman to the humble peasant, was simple and terrifying. What happens now? The new masters of Iran were pragmatic. They were warriors, not accountants or civil engineers, and they found themselves in possession of a sophisticated, ancient, and deeply complex society. Their first priority was to maintain control. To do this, they largely kept themselves separate from the population they had conquered. Instead of dispersing throughout the countryside, they established great garrison cities, known as Amsar, in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, which had been the heartland of the Sasanian state. They founded Basra and Kufa. These settlements began as sprawling military camps laid out in tribal quarters, but they quickly swelled into bustling hubs of Arab power, commerce, and culture. They were islands of Arabic language and Islamic law in a vast Persian sea, the nerve centers from which the new administration would attempt to govern its enormous prize. For the conquered people, the vast majority of whom were Zoroastrians, with significant Christian and Jewish communities, a new social order was established. Under Islamic law, they were granted the status of dhimmi, or protected people. It's a common misconception that the conquerors galloped through Iran, forcing everyone to convert on pain of death. The reality, as is often the case, was far more complicated and, frankly, more bureaucratic. In exchange for recognizing the supremacy of Muslim rule, the dhimmi were allowed to practice their own religion, maintain their own places of worship, and live by their own communal laws. But this protection came at a price, and that price was a tax called the jizya. The jizya was a poll tax levied on all non-Muslim adult males, alongside the kharaj, a tax on agricultural land which everyone had to pay. It became the financial bedrock of the new caliphate. The logic was straightforward. Non-Muslims were exempt from the military service required of Muslims, and the jizya was their payment for the state's protection. For the early caliphs, this system was incredibly lucrative. A vast, tax-paying, non-Muslim population was, in purely economic terms, a tremendous asset. This created a strange, almost ironic disincentive to encourage conversion. Every time a Persian Zoroastrian embraced Islam, the state treasury potentially lost a taxpayer. It's the kind of budget headache that would make any government accountant sigh in exasperation. As a result, conversion to Islam was a slow, gradual process, trickling over centuries rather than flooding in a single wave. Those who did convert, often for genuine reasons of faith, but just as often for the social and economic advantages it might bring, found themselves in a difficult position. These new, non-Arab Muslims were known as the Mawali, or clients. In the tribal structure of Arab society, a newcomer had to attach themselves to a powerful Arab tribe for protection and status. For a Persian, whose ancestors might have been running a sophisticated bureaucracy while the Arabs were still largely nomadic tribes, this was a profound humiliation. Worse still, the ruling Umayyad dynasty, which seized control of the caliphate in 661 and moved the capital to Damascus, was an Arab-centric regime. They viewed Islam almost as an Arab ethnic property, and the Mawali were rarely, if ever, treated as true equals. They were often looked down upon, denied equal pay in the army, and in many cases were even forced to continue paying the very taxes they had converted to escape. This created a massive and deeply resentful class of people, men who were Muslim in faith, but second class in status. They felt betrayed by the promise of Islamic equality and were caught between two worlds. They were no longer part of the old Zoroastrian community, but they were not fully accepted by the new Arab ruling class either. This simmering discontent of the Mawali would become one of the most destabilizing forces in the entire caliphate. Meanwhile, what of the old Persian elite, the powerful semi-feudal noble houses that had constantly challenged the Sasanian Shahs, were largely shattered by the conquest. But the Arabs soon discovered that you cannot run a country without the people who know how to run it. The local landed gentry, a class of men known as the Decans, had been the backbone of Sasanian provincial administration for centuries. They managed the estates, maintained the vital irrigation systems, and most importantly, knew exactly who owned what and how much tax they owed. The new Arab governors, unable to read the complex Pahlavi script of the Sasanian tax registers and utterly unfamiliar with the landscape, had little choice but to lean on them. And so, a quiet, pragmatic arrangement was made. The Deccan would keep his lands and a measure of his local authority. In return, he would now collect the taxes for a new master and send the revenue west to Damascus instead of Ctesiphon. He was a collaborator out of necessity, a survivor, preserving a fragment of the old order within the framework of the new. So, in the first decades after the conquest, a strange, partitioned society emerged. In the garrison cities, the Arabic language dominated. The call to prayer echoed from newly built mosques. A new legal and political culture took root. But out in the villages and old towns of the plateau, life continued with a different rhythm. Persian remained the language of the home and the field. Mothers still told their children the epic stories of Rustam and the kings of old. And though the great fire temples were often abandoned or converted, in quiet, hidden places, the old faith was kept alive, a symbol of a deeply wounded but resilient cultural identity. Iran had been conquered, but it had not been erased. It was merely dormant, its people watching, waiting, and adapting, while the pressures of inequality and resentment slowly built beneath the surface of the caliph's peace. Beneath the surface of the caliph's peace, the pressure was building. For decades, the Umayyad Caliphate, ruling from its sun-drenched capital in Damascus, had governed its vast empire with the air of an Arab aristocracy. It was a government of conquerors for conquerors. And nowhere was this felt more keenly than in the sprawling eastern province of Khorasan. Here, in this frontier land of windswept plains and rugged mountains, the resentments we saw simmering in the last chapter were reaching a boiling point. The Persian Mawali, the converts to Islam, were still treated as second-class citizens, their dreams of equality dashed against the rocks of Arab privilege. Many of the Arab colonists themselves, who had settled there generations ago, felt forgotten and neglected by the distant, decadent court in Damascus. They saw the Umayyad caliphs less as pious successors to the Prophet and more as worldly kings, living in lavish palaces, far from the original spirit of their faith. This widespread discontent was a field of dry grass, waiting for a spark, and that spark was being carefully, secretly prepared by a rival clan. In the small, isolated town of Humayma in the Jordanian desert, the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad's uncle, Abbas, were plotting. They were the Abbasids, and they believed that leadership of the Muslim world was their birthright. They were members of the Prophet's own clan, the Banu Hashim, and they began to send out clandestine missionaries, or da'is, to the far corners of the empire. These agents moved in secret, spreading a powerful and carefully crafted message. The time of the corrupt Umayyads was ending, and a new era of justice was coming. A righteous leader from the family of the Prophet would soon rise to restore the purity of Islam. The message was deliberately vague about which member of the Prophet's family it would be, allowing different groups to hear what they wanted to hear. But the place where this message found its most fertile ground was Khorasan. The Abbasid agents skillfully wove together the different threads of opposition. It was a mainstream historical fact that this was not a simple Persian uprising against Arabs. It was a brilliant and complex coalition. They appealed to the Persian Mawali with the promise of true equality, to the disgruntled Arab settlers with the promise of a more just Islamic government, and to those loyal to the memory of the Prophet's son-in-law, Ali, with the promise of restoring the family's rightful place. To lead this burgeoning underground movement, the Abbasid Imam sent a figure of singular genius and mystery, a man known as Abu Muslim. His origins are shrouded in legend. He was likely a Persian Mawali himself, a man of humble birth who possessed an iron will, a brilliant strategic mind, and a chilling charisma. Arriving in Khorasan in the early 740s, Abu Muslim was the ultimate revolutionary organizer. He moved quietly at first, building his network, uniting the factions, and preparing for the perfect moment to strike. He was a master of propaganda, a man who understood the power of a symbol. He chose for his movement the black banner, the color of the Prophet's clan, a stark and dramatic rejection of the white banners of the Umayyads. It was a symbol of piety, of legitimacy, and of a promise for a dark reckoning. In the summer of 747, on the day of a great festival, the signal was given. Outside the great oasis city of Merv, Abu Muslim unfurled the black banners. It was an open declaration of war, and the province, so long simmering, exploded. The rebellion spread with astonishing speed. The Umayyad governor was caught completely off guard, his authority collapsing overnight. Abu Muslim's army, a disciplined and highly motivated force of Khorasanis, both Persian and Arab, swelled with new recruits. One city after another fell to the black banners. The revolution was no longer a secret conspiracy. It was a torrent, sweeping westwards out of Khorasan and onto the Iranian plateau. The Umayyad Caliph in Damascus, Marwan II, was an experienced general, but he had underestimated the threat until it was too late. He raised a massive army and marched to confront the rebels. The two forces met in early 750 at the Battle of the Great Sab River in northern Iraq. The Khorasani army, though outnumbered, was fanatical and brilliantly led. They formed a solid wall of spearmen, a tactic that broke the charge of the Umayyad cavalry. The imperial army was shattered, and the caliph himself fled the battlefield. The battle was a decisive turning point. The back of Umayyad military power was broken. The road to Damascus was now open, but the Abbasid army didn't stop there. They pursued Marwan II relentlessly, chasing him through Syria, into Palestine, and finally down into Egypt, where the last Umayyad caliph was cornered and killed in a small village on the Nile. The revenge of the Abbasids was as ruthless as their planning had been meticulous. To ensure that the old dynasty could never return, they set about exterminating the entire Umayyad clan. In one famously grim episode, the new Abbasid leader invited some 80 remaining Umayyad princes to a banquet under a flag of truce, promising reconciliation. Partway through the meal, his soldiers entered, clubbed every single one of the guests to death, and then, so the story goes, laid leather carpets over the still groaning bodies and finished their dinner. It was a brutal, bloody message to the world. There was a new power in charge. In the great mosque of Kufa, the city that had once been the capital of Ali, the first Abbasid caliph was publicly acclaimed. He was Abu al-Abbas, and he gave himself the title al-Safa, the generous, or more ominously, the bloodshedder. Standing before the people, he promised a new beginning, a new government based on piety and justice, a universal Islamic empire where your worth was based on your faith, not your bloodline. For the Persians who had formed the backbone of his army, it felt like a moment of liberation. Their decades of humiliation were over. They had toppled the arrogant Arab regime of Damascus. But what they did not yet fully realize was that by bringing the Abbasids to power, they had not simply swapped one Arab dynasty for another. They had fundamentally changed the direction of the entire Islamic world. The center of gravity, which for a century had been in Syria, was now inexorably shifting east, back towards the old Persian heartlands of Mesopotamia and Iran. A change that would have consequences no one could yet imagine. The revolution born in the east had been won. The black banners of the Abbasids flew over a territory stretching from North Africa to the borders of India. But the men who had carried those banners, the Khurasanis, who had marched halfway across a continent, had not just installed a new dynasty. They had brought their world with them. The new caliph, Abu al-Abbas al-Safa, and his even more formidable brother and successor, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, understood a fundamental truth. The heart of their power now lay in the east, in the lands of the old Persian Empire. The Arab-centric world of Damascus was politically and spiritually 1,000 miles away. A new era required a new capital. Al-Mansur was the true architect of the Abbasid state, a man of immense talent, foresight, and a chillingly pragmatic cruelty. He knew that to truly cement his family's rule, he needed to build a capital worthy of their new universal vision of the caliphate. He chose a site in Mesopotamia, on the west bank of the Tigris River, a location that was a master stroke of political symbolism. It was strategically located at the crossroads of ancient trade routes, but more importantly, it was just a stone's throw from the haunting ruins of Ctesiphon, the old Sasanian imperial capital we saw fall in our first chapter. The message was clear. A new, great empire was rising from the ashes of the old. The name chosen for this new city, Baghdad, was itself a Persian word, meaning gift of God. Construction began in 762 on a date deemed most auspicious by a team of court astrologers led by a Persian named Nawbakht. The city that rose from the plains was unlike any other in the Islamic world. Officially named Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace, it was a perfect circle, a fortress city with two immense outer walls of baked brick and a deep moat. Four massive gates, named for the destinations they faced, Kufa, Basra, Damascus, and Khorasan, pierced the walls, leading to the city's heart. And at the absolute, geometric center of it all, in a vast central enclosure, stood the Caliph's palace, the Golden Gate, and the city's great mosque. The design was a statement of power, a map of the cosmos with the Caliph at its center, the axis upon which the entire world turned. Historians still argue about the exact degree to which the round city's design was a direct copy of Sasanian models, but the symbolic choice of location and the reliance on Persian expertise are undeniable. This Persian influence wasn't just in the bricks and mortar, it was in the very structure of the new government. The Abbasids, in their quest to create a more sophisticated and centralized state than the Umayyads had managed, looked directly to the Sasanian playbook. They created a complex, multi-layered bureaucracy of government departments, or diwans, to handle everything from tax collection to the postal service. And at the head of this entire apparatus, they created a new and immensely powerful position, the vizier. The vizier was the caliph's chief minister, the head of the civil service, the man who ran the day-to-day affairs of the empire, leaving the caliph free to focus on matters of state and religion. This was a Persian concept, adopted wholesale, and the first great family to dominate this new office was Persian. They were the Barmakids, from a noble family in Khorasan. The family patriarch, Khalid ibn Barmak, had been an early and crucial supporter of the revolution. He became a trusted advisor to al-Safa and al-Mansur, and his family's star rose with the new dynasty. His son, Yahya, became the vizier for the most famous of all Abbasid caliphs, Harun al-Rashid, Yahya's own sons, al-Fadl, and the legendary Jafar, a name you might remember from the tales of the 1001 Nights, held the highest offices, effectively governing the empire in the caliph's name. For almost 2 decades, the Barmakids were the embodiment of this new Perso-Islamic synthesis. They were patrons of the arts and sciences, fantastically wealthy, and wielded a power second only to the caliph himself. Under their guidance, Baghdad blossomed into the world's foremost center of learning and culture. The city quickly outgrew its original round walls, sprawling across both banks of the Tigris. It was a metropolis of palaces, mosques, libraries, hospitals, and bustling bazaars. At the caliph's court, Persian culture became the height of fashion. Courtiers adopted Sasanian-style robes and hats. Persian festivals like Nowruz, the spring equinox, were celebrated with lavish festivities. Persian cuisine, with its rich sauces and delicate sweets, graced the caliph's table. An enormous translation movement began, rendering Persian works of literature, history, and science into Arabic. The empire was ruled by an Arab caliph, and its official language was Arabic, but its taste, its style, and its administrative soul were becoming undeniably Persian. But there was a hard limit to this influence. The caliph was still the absolute master, and no one was allowed to forget it. The fate of Abu Muslim, the man who had brought the Abbasids to power, served as a grim reminder. Al-Mansur, ever the pragmatist, saw the charismatic revolutionary leader as a threat, a man with too much power and too much loyalty from the Khurasani army. He summoned Abu Muslim to court, received him with full honors, praised his service to the dynasty, and then, in the middle of the audience, had him cut down by hidden guards. It was a cold and brutal act, but it sent an unmistakable message. The revolution was over. All power, all loyalty was owed to the Caliph alone. Even the Barmakids would eventually learn this lesson when Harun al-Rashid, for reasons that are still debated, abruptly turned on them, imprisoning Yahya and executing his beloved Jafar. Still, the die had been cast. The Abbasid revolution had done more than change a dynasty. It had moved the center of the Islamic world east and opened the floodgates of Persian culture. The magnificent new city of Baghdad, the jewel of the world, stood as a testament to this new order. An empire with an Arab head and a Persian heart. A glorious and often tense partnership that would define the golden age of Islam. For a time, the city of Baghdad was the undisputed center of the world, a dazzling universe of power, wealth, and learning held in orbit by the gravity of the Caliph. But even the most powerful gravity weakens over distance. The Abbasid Empire was immense, a sprawling territory of diverse peoples and landscapes. And the further one traveled from the golden palaces on the Tigris, the fainter the Caliph's authority became. Out on the empire's eastern frontier, in the vast and restless province of Khorasan, that had been the cradle of the Abbasid revolution itself, the old Persian spirit of independence, which had been subdued but never extinguished, began to stir once more. The caliphs would soon learn that governing a place from half a continent away is a very difficult business. The first crack in the edifice of central control appeared not with a bang, but with a calculated, almost silent gesture. It came from a man named Tahir ibn Hussein. Tahir was a Persian general of great skill, nicknamed Dul Yamanain, or the ambidextrous, for his ability to wield a sword in either hand. He had been the chief military architect of the Caliph al-Mamun's victory in a brutal civil war against his brother. As a reward for his indispensable service, in 821, Tahir was made the governor of Khorasan and all the lands east of it. He was, in effect, a viceroy, ruling a huge territory in the Caliph's name. But Tahir had ambitions that went beyond being a loyal servant. In the year 820, during the formal Friday sermon, the khutbah, in the great mosque of Nishapur, Tahir did something extraordinary. The Friday sermon was not just a religious event. It was a profound political statement. A key part of the ritual was a prayer for the health and success of the reigning caliph, a public acknowledgement of his sovereignty. But on this day, Tahir instructed the prayer leader to simply omit the caliph's name. In the silence that followed, everyone present understood the message. It was a mainstream historical fact in the medieval Islamic world that this omission was the recognized signal of rebellion, a quiet but unmistakable declaration of independence. When news of this insult reached Baghdad, the caliph was apoplectic with rage. An army was prepared to march east and crush the insolent governor. But before it could even depart, news arrived that Tahir had died suddenly in his bed. The crisis was averted, But the Caliph, still politically weak from the civil war, was forced into a humiliating compromise. He confirmed Tahir's son, Talha, as the next governor of Khorasan. With that, the Tahirid dynasty was born. For the next 50 years, they ruled Khorasan as their own private kingdom. On the surface, they were perfect subjects. They sent regular, if perhaps slightly reduced, tribute to Baghdad. They stamped the caliph's name on their coinage, and after that first incident, dutifully included him in the Friday prayers. But in reality, they were independent kings. They appointed their own officials, raised their own armies, and ran their own foreign policy. They were cultured and effective rulers, patronizing poets and investing in agriculture, bringing a welcome period of stability and prosperity to the region. They showed that it was possible to carve out a Persian kingdom while still paying lip service to the idea of a unified caliphate. If the Tahirids represented a gentle, aristocratic peeling away from Abbasid control, the next force to arise in the east was a violent tearing. This movement came not from a polished general, but from a man of the people. His name was Yaqub ibn al-Layth, and he was known as al-Safar, the coppersmith. He emerged from Sistan, a wild and remote region on the border of modern Iran and Afghanistan. Yaqub was no courtier. He was a charismatic warlord who gathered around him a loyal army of volunteers, fighting for a raw, revived Persian identity. He was a populist hero, and he had nothing but contempt for the distant, wealthy caliph in Baghdad and his polite, Tahirid servants in Nishapur. Yaqub the coppersmith was a force of nature. Starting in the 860s, he and his Safarid army swept out of Sistan, conquering city after city. He was a brilliant and ruthless commander. In 873, he marched on the Tahirid capital of Nishapur and, in a single blow, extinguished the dynasty that had ruled for half a century. Unlike the Tahirids, Yaqub made no pretense of loyalty to Baghdad. He was an open rebel, and his goal was nothing less than the restoration of a glorious Persian empire. He is credited with being the first ruler since the Sasanian Shahs to demand that poetry praising him be composed not in the prestigious Arabic of the court, but in his own Persian tongue. When a poet began to recite a poem in Arabic, Yaqub allegedly cut him off, saying, "Why must I be praised in a language I do not understand?" His ambition was boundless. After consolidating his rule over most of Iran and parts of Afghanistan, he did the unthinkable. He marched on Baghdad itself. In 876, his army advanced deep into Iraq, threatening the very heart of the caliphate. The panic in the capital was immense. The caliph gathered every soldier he could find to make a desperate stand. The Safarid army, exhausted from its long march, was finally defeated just a day's march from the city. Yaqub was forced to retreat, but he had given the Abbasids a terrifying shock. He had proven that a humble coppersmith from a forgotten province could shake the throne of the most powerful empire on earth. Yaqub never gave up his dream, but he died of illness a few years later. His empire, built on sheer force of will, largely crumbled without him. But his legacy was profound. He had reawakened a fierce, proud, and militant Persian spirit. He, and the more diplomatic Tahirids before him, had demonstrated that the caliph's power was no longer absolute. The era of direct rule from Baghdad was over. The Iranian plateau was breaking apart into a patchwork of local kingdoms, each with its own ambitions and its own unique character. The caliphate's long, slow decline had begun. The violent, populist energy of Yaqub the coppersmith had shaken the caliphate to its core. But his empire, built on the charisma of one man, was a flash flood. It roared and then receded. In its wake, the political landscape of eastern Iran was once again fractured. Into this vacuum stepped a new dynasty, one that offered a very different vision of Iranian rule. They were not populist warlords from the fringes, but members of the ancient Persian-landed aristocracy, the Dehkans, who had quietly governed their ancestral lands for generations. They were the Samanids, and they traced their lineage back to the Sasanian nobility. While the Tahirids had been diplomats and the Safarids had been conquerors, the Samanids would be something else entirely. They would be gardeners of a civilization based in the fabled Silk Road cities of Transoxiana, the lands beyond the river Oxus. The Samanids consolidated their power with a quiet competence. Their capital, Bukhara, had for centuries been a crossroads of commerce and ideas, but under their rule, it would be transformed into one of the brightest intellectual and cultural centers in the world, a worthy rival to Baghdad itself. Like the dynasties before them, the Samanids maintained the convenient fiction that they were merely loyal governors of the Abbasid Caliph. They sent polite letters and valuable gifts to Baghdad and acknowledged the Caliph's spiritual authority. But in every other respect, they were kings of a proud and independent realm. Their legitimacy came not from a piece of paper from a distant caliph, but from their deep roots in the Iranian soil and their conscious revival of Persian traditions of kingship and high culture. The court of the Samanid emirs, particularly under the long and brilliant reign of Nasr II in the early 10th century, was a paradise for scholars, scientists, and above all, for poets. What happened in the palaces and gardens of Bukhara and Samarkand during this period was nothing short of a cultural renaissance. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Samanids' patronage was directly responsible for the survival and flourishing of New Persian as a literary language, a project that had profound consequences for world literature. For nearly 3 centuries, Arabic had been the language of power, religion, and high culture. Persian was the language of the home and the street, but it was not considered a suitable vehicle for great art. The Samanids set out to change that. They actively sought out and lavishly funded poets who would write in the Persian language. The towering figure of this new literary dawn was Rudaki. Born in a small village near Samarkand, he was blind from birth, but he possessed a prodigious memory and a celestial gift for music and verse. He came to the court in Bukhara and became its brightest star, a poet laureate whose fame spread throughout the Eastern Islamic world. Rudaki is known as the father of Persian poetry for good reason. He took the Persian language, which was still rough and unpolished, and proved that it could express the most subtle emotions and the most profound ideas. His verses, often sung to the accompaniment of a lute, spoke of the beauty of the gardens of Bukhara, the sweetness of wine, the sorrow of fleeting youth, and the wisdom of his royal patrons. He laid the foundation upon which all the later giants of Persian poetry, Hafez, Saadi, Rumi, would build. But the Samanid court was not just a home for poets. The emirs were passionate bibliophiles, and their royal library in Bukhara was legendary. It was said to contain books on every conceivable subject, from Greek philosophy and Indian mathematics to Persian history and Islamic theology. It was this very library that would give a precocious local teenager his education. The young man, known as Ibn Sina or Avicenna in the West, was a physician of astonishing genius after he successfully treated the Samanid emir for a serious illness. He was granted access to the royal library as his reward. He later wrote that he entered the library and found a universe, rooms filled with chests of books on poetry, medicine, logic, and metaphysics. He read them all, absorbing the accumulated knowledge of the ancient and Islamic worlds. The fertile intellectual environment created by the Samanids directly nurtured one of the greatest minds in human history. It's important to understand that this cultural revival was not a rejection of Islam. The Samanids were devout Sunni Muslims who built magnificent mosques and generously sponsored religious scholars. They saw no conflict at all between their deep Islamic faith and their proud Iranian heritage. Their great achievement was the fusion of the two, creating a sophisticated Perso-Islamic civilization. In their capital, a scholar might debate the finer points of Islamic law in Arabic in the morning, and then listen to a recitation of epic Persian poetry in the evening. This synthesis of Persian culture and Sunni Islam would become the dominant cultural model for centuries, spreading with Turkic dynasties into Anatolia and India. The Samanids, through their wisdom and patronage, did more than just rule a kingdom. They rescued the Persian language from a potential fate of becoming a regional dialect and elevated it into a language of immortal art. They cultivated a garden where the seeds of Persian identity, buried for centuries under layers of foreign rule, could once again sprout and blossom into a magnificent new form. They were not just kings, they were the architects of a cultural dawn, an era of light and learning whose glow would illuminate the path for generations to come, preparing the ground for the creation of Iran's single most important literary masterpiece. While the Samanid emirs were cultivating their magnificent cultural garden in the east, the situation in western Iran and Iraq was descending into a chaotic free-for-all. Here, there was no stable aristocratic power to keep the peace. The authority of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad had become a ghost, a flickering candle in a storm. The real power in the capital was held by the Caliph's own Turkic Praetorian Guard, who raised and deposed caliphs at will, treating the supposed leader of the faithful as their personal pawn. The provinces of western Iran had dissolved into a patchwork of warring city-states and petty kingdoms, all run by ambitious warlords and mercenaries. It was a dark and violent time, a perfect environment for a new and formidable power to rise from a place no one expected. They came from Dalam, a rugged, isolated region of forested mountains and misty valleys tucked against the southern shore of the Caspian Sea. The Dalamites were a people apart. For centuries, they had fiercely resisted the reach of the caliphate, holding on to their independence and their unique martial traditions. They were famous as tough, disciplined infantrymen, fighting with a distinctive two-pronged spear and a large shield, and were highly sought after as mercenaries. Only recently had they begun to convert to Islam, and the form they adopted was primarily Shia Islam, setting them apart from the Sunni majority of the caliphate. They were a hardy, ambitious, and hungry people, waiting for a leader to match their spirit. That leadership emerged in the form of three brothers, the sons of a fisherman named Abu Shuja Buya. His sons, Ali, Hassan, and Ahmad, were men of humble origin but boundless ambition. They left their mountain home and began their careers as soldiers of fortune, serving in the armies of other warlords. But they quickly proved to be more skilled and more cunning than their paymasters. Through a combination of daring military victories and shrewd political maneuvering, the Buyid brothers began to conquer territory for themselves. The eldest, Ali, established a base in the great city of Isfahan. Soon, they had seized control of most of western and southern Iran, with the beautiful city of Shiraz becoming their main capital. They were no longer mercenaries. They were the masters of a new and rising kingdom. Meanwhile, in Baghdad, the situation had become completely untenable. The Caliph, al-Mustakfi, was living in constant fear of his own Turkic guards. The city was bankrupt and plagued by factional street fighting. The Caliphate was an empty shell, and everyone knew it. In a final, desperate gamble to find a protector who might be more manageable than his own rebellious army, the Caliph's court sent a message to the youngest and most ambitious of the Buyid brothers, Ahmad. It was an invitation to enter Baghdad and restore order. In the winter of 945, Ahmad and his disciplined Daylamite army marched into the capital of the Islamic world, not as saviors, but as new masters. The Turkic generals fled, their power broken overnight. The era of the Caliph's guards was over. The era of the Buyids had begun. Ahmad wasted no time in formalizing his new position. He went to the palace of the Caliph and compelled him to grant him the title of Amir al-Umara, the commander of commanders. This was a new title, effectively making him the military dictator of what was left of the Abbasid state. The Caliph also bestowed grand Persian-style honorific titles on all three brothers. Ali became Imad al-Dawla, the pillar of the state. Hassan became Rukn al-Dawla, the cornerstone of the state, and Ahmad himself became Mu'iz al-Dawla, the glorifier of the state. Just a few weeks later, Ahmad, suspecting the Caliph of plotting against him, had him deposed and blinded, installing a more pliable successor. The message was now brutally clear. The Caliph was a puppet, and the Buyids were pulling the strings. This established one of the most peculiar political arrangements in Islamic history. For over a century, the spiritual head of the Sunni world would be a powerless puppet under the military control of a staunchly Shia dynasty. The Buyids understood that they could not simply abolish the caliphate. The office, however weakened, still held immense symbolic legitimacy for the vast Sunni population of the empire. So they kept the caliph in his palace, a prisoner in gilded robes. He was allowed to issue decrees written by his Buyid masters. His name was mentioned in the Friday prayers, and his face appeared on the coinage. He was the rubber stamp that gave a veneer of legality to Buyid rule. It was the ultimate case of managing from behind the throne. As devout Shia, the Buyids did not hide their faith. For the first time, Shia Islam had powerful state patrons at the very center of the caliphate. They sponsored Shia theologians and established public rituals that had previously been suppressed. In Baghdad, the Buyids instituted the public commemoration of Ghadir Kum, the day Shia believed the Prophet appointed Ali as his successor. Even more dramatically, they established the public day of mourning for the death of the Prophet's grandson, Imam Hussein, on the day of Ashura, when the city's markets would be closed and people would march in procession through the streets. This open expression of Shia piety in the Sunni capital was a revolutionary change, one that permanently elevated the status and visibility of Shiism in Iraq and Iran. The Buyid state, however, was less a unified empire and more of a family federation. The different branches of the family ruled their own territories from Baghdad, Shiraz, and the city of Rai, often quarreling and fighting amongst themselves over succession. But for now, these fierce warriors from the Caspian Mountains had achieved the unthinkable. They had risen from total obscurity, conquered a kingdom, and seized control of the very heart of Islam. The Caliph was a ghost in his own palace, and the real power now lay with the descendants of a Dalamite fisherman. In the fractured landscape of 10th century Iran, with Dalamite soldiers ruling in the west and Samanid aristocrats in the east, the land was politically divided, but its soul was being reforged. The cultural revival we saw blossom in the gardens of Bukhara was more than just a courtly fashion. It was a deep and urgent quest for identity. After 3 centuries of living in the shadow of the caliphate, of using Arabic as the language of prestige, a question hung in the air. What did it mean to be Persian? The old stories of the Sasanian Shahs and the mythical heroes of antiquity were fading, preserved in crumbling Pahlavi manuscripts and the fallible memories of old men. For Persian culture to truly be reborn, it needed more than just charming lyrics about wine and roses. It needed a foundation, a sacred text of its own history and mythology, a grand narrative to anchor it for all time. This monumental task would be taken up not by a king or a warrior, but by a single, determined poet. His name was Abul Qasim Ferdowsi. He was born around the year 940 in a village near the city of Tus in Khorasan, the very heartland of the Persian cultural revival. Crucially, Ferdowsi belonged to the Deccan class, the landed gentry who saw themselves as the direct descendants of the old Sasanian aristocracy. This class had been the custodians of Iran's pre-Islamic heritage, the keepers of the flame during the long centuries of Arab rule. Ferdowsi grew up breathing in these stories, the epic tales of kings and demons, of tragic heroes and star-crossed lovers. The idea of turning the prose chronicles of ancient Iran into a grand epic poem was already in the air. A younger poet at the Samanid court, Dakiki, had begun the work, but he was murdered by one of his slaves after composing only about 1,000 verses. Ferdowsi, then a man in his prime, saw this as his calling. He took up the fallen torch, driven by what seems to have been a profound sense of patriotic duty. He understood that if this work was not done, the memory of 1,000 years of his people's history could be lost forever. And so began one of the most astonishing literary undertakings in human history. For the next 30 years, Ferdowsi dedicated his life to this one single work, the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. Imagine him in his study, year after year, the seasons turning outside his window. He gathers the old prose chronicles. He consults with Zoroastrian priests, for their knowledge of ancient myths, and he begins the painstaking process of weaving these disparate threads into a single, seamless tapestry of rhyming couplets. The final work would stretch to some 60,000 couplets, more than 7 times the length of Homer's Iliad. It is a work of almost unimaginable scope, beginning with the creation of the world and the reign of the first mythical kings, who taught humanity how to make fire and forge tools. It then moves into its longest and most beloved section, the heroic age. Here, the narrative is dominated by the incredible deeds of the hero Rostam, a warrior of superhuman strength and tragic flaws, and his magnificent horse, Raksh. We follow Rustam through countless battles against the enemies of Iran, his epic struggles with demons, and his heartbreaking, unwitting duel with his own long-lost son, Sohrab. Finally, the epic transitions into the historical age, recounting the reigns of Alexander the Great, the Parthians, and finally the Sasanian Shahs, ending with the melancholy tale of the Arab conquest and the death of the last king, Yazdegerd III. Ferdowsi's linguistic achievement was just as monumental as his narrative one. In an era when Arabic was still the dominant language of scholarship, he made a conscious choice to write in a pure, powerful Persian, deliberately avoiding Arabic words wherever possible. He was mining the bedrock of his native tongue, polishing its jewels and proving its worth. The Shahnameh became a vast treasury of the Persian language, preserving its core vocabulary and structure. It is not an exaggeration to say that Ferdowsi did for Persian what Dante did for Italian or Shakespeare did for English. He gave it its definitive, classic, and immortal form. After 3 decades of labor, the old poet finally completed his masterpiece around the year 1010. But by then, his patrons, the Samanids, had been swept away by a new power, the Turkic Ghaznavids. Ferdowsi took his life's work to the court of the new ruler, the formidable Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna. And here, the story takes a tragic turn. Historians still argue whether the famous story of the Sultan's insult is literally true in all its details, but its endurance speaks to a deeper truth about the relationship between artist and power. The legend says that Mahmud, a pragmatic Turkic warrior with little taste for Persian mythology, had promised Ferdowsi a gold coin for every couplet. But when the epic was presented, the Sultan, perhaps influenced by jealous courtiers, offered him only 60,000 silver coins, a fraction of the promised reward. Ferdowsi, old and proud, was deeply insulted. He supposedly left the palace, went to a bathhouse, and split the entire payment between the bathkeeper and a man selling beer. He then penned a vicious satire against the Sultan and fled into exile, a heartbroken and impoverished man. But while the poet died in relative obscurity, his work would achieve a glorious immortality. The Shahnameh was not just a collection of stories. It was the definitive statement of Iranian identity, a mirror in which a people could see their own history, their values, their language, and their soul. It transcended politics and religion, becoming the shared heritage of every Persian speaker. For the next 1,000 years, its tales would be recited by storytellers in village squares. Its scenes would be painted in exquisite miniatures by royal artists, and its verses would be memorized by children. Ferdowsi had done more than write a book. He had saved a civilization's memory from the mists of time. The immortal verses of the Shahnameh had given Iran a unified soul, but its body remained violently divided. As the 10th century bled into the 11th, the dream of a single, cohesive Iranian kingdom, which had flickered under the Samanids, finally shattered. The political map of the region came to resemble a broken piece of pottery, a mosaic of rival states, each ruled by an ambitious warlord, each vying for supremacy. From the mountains of the west to the plains of the east, the land was exhausted by the tramp of marching armies and the constant anxiety of shifting allegiances. It was an age of petty kings, and supreme power belonged to whoever had the strongest army and the most ruthless will. In the east, the brilliant cultural dawn of the Samanids had reached its twilight. Their kingdom, which had once stretched deep into Central Asia, found itself caught in a fatal vice. From the north, a powerful confederation of Turkic tribes, the Karakhanids, swept down from the steppes and seized the great cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, the very heart of the Samanid realm. The dynasty that had nurtured Rudaki and Ibn Sina was unceremoniously snuffed out. At the same time, their power was eaten away from the south by their own servants. It's a mainstream historical fact that the institution of Ghulam, or slave soldiery, paradoxically led to the downfall of many dynasties. Rulers would purchase and train young Turkic boys from the steppes to form an elite, loyal army. But these highly trained and ambitious military slaves often ended up overthrowing their masters and founding dynasties of their own. This is precisely what happened to the Samanids. One of their Turkic slave generals established a breakaway state in the remote mountain fortress of Ghazna, in modern-day Afghanistan. From this small beginning rose a new and formidable empire, the Ghaznavids, and the man who forged this empire was Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, the very same ruler who so famously failed to appreciate Ferdowsi's masterpiece. Mahmud, who came to power in 998, was a new breed of monarch. He was not a Persian aristocrat or a Dalamite Highlander. He was the son of a Turkic slave, a brilliant and brutally effective military commander, and a fiercely devout Sunni Muslim. He quickly finished off the last remnants of the Samanid state, conquering Khorasan and making himself the undisputed master of eastern Iran. His court at Ghazna became a center of power, and, despite his treatment of Ferdowsi, a major center of Persian culture, attracting scholars like the great polymath al-Biruni. But Mahmud's fame and the immense wealth that funded his empire came from another direction: India. For 30 years, he launched a series of relentless and devastating annual raids deep into the rich plains of northern India. Motivated by a combination of religious zeal, he saw himself as a holy warrior, or Ghazi, smashing Hindu idols, and a rapacious desire for treasure. His campaigns were legendary. His armies would descend from the Afghan passes, defeat the forces of the Hindu princes, and sack the great temple cities, carrying away plunder on a scale that was almost unimaginable. Gold, silver, jewels, and thousands of captives flowed back to Ghazna, transforming his remote mountain capital into a city of splendid mosques and lavish palaces, all built with the wealth of India. For the people of eastern Iran, Mahmud was a powerful and pious protector. For the people of northern India, he was a terrifying scourge. While Mahmud was building his empire in the east, the Buyid dynasty in the west was slowly consuming itself. The first generation of three strong brothers who had conquered Baghdad was long gone. Their descendants, the second and third generation of Buyid princes, had inherited their ambition but not their unity. They engaged in constant, debilitating civil wars against one another, fighting over the great cities of Rey, Isfahan, and Baghdad itself. Their authority was weakened, their treasuries were empty, and the Dalamite infantry that had once been their strength was becoming a fractious and unreliable force. The pillar of the state had begun to crack and crumble. The caliph they held captive in Baghdad was as powerless as ever, but so increasingly were his keepers. Between these two major powers, the Ghaznavids in the east and the decaying Buyids in the west, a dozen smaller players tried to carve out their own domains. In the Caspian region, the Ziarids, another Dalamite dynasty, held on to a small but culturally significant kingdom. In central Iran, local warlords took advantage of the Buyid weakness to assert their own independence. Power was fluid and temporary. A city might belong to one emir in the spring and be conquered by his cousin by the autumn harvest. For the ordinary person, the farmer, the artisan, the merchant, it was a time of deep uncertainty, a life lived under the constant threat of a new tax collector, a new governor, or a new army appearing at the gates. Beneath all this chaos, a fundamental change was taking place. The military and political dominance was shifting decisively from Iranian peoples like the Persians and Delamites to the Turks. The Karakhanids and the Ghaznavids were the new superpowers of the region, and their strength rested on the back of Turkic cavalry. A new age was dawning, an age of Turkic sultans, and as the 11th century wore on, and the rival kings and princes of Iran continued their endless squabbles, they remained blissfully unaware that far away, on the vast grasslands beyond the Oxus River, a new and far greater wave of Turkic tribes was on the move. They were called the Oghuz, and their leaders, the family of Seljuk, were about to bring an end to this land of petty kings and unite it under an empire larger than any seen for centuries. The patchwork of petty kingdoms that was 11th century Iran was a house divided against itself, exhausted by internal feuds and ripe for conquest. The rulers of this fractured land, the Ghaznavids in the east and the Buyids in the west, looked upon each other as their main rivals, blind to the storm that was gathering on the far side of the Oxus River. There, on the immense, windswept grasslands of Central Asia, a vast migration was underway. They were the Oghuz Turks, a confederation of nomadic tribes who lived their lives in the saddle. They moved with their enormous herds of sheep, goats, and horses, slept in circular felt yurts, and possessed a mastery of mounted archery that had been honed over 1,000 years of steppe warfare. And the clan that led them, the family of a chieftain named Seljuk, was about to ride out of the steppes and onto the pages of history. The grandsons of Seljuk, two brothers named Tugril and Chagri, were the leaders of this great migration. Chagri was the master strategist and military commander, while Tugril was the brilliant political leader. Sometime in the late 10th century, their clan had converted to Sunni Islam, a decision that would prove immensely consequential. It gave them a religious legitimacy and a cultural key that would allow them to unlock the gates of the settled, Persian-speaking world to their south. Driven by the pressures of climate change, the need for new pasture for their flocks, and the push of other rival tribes from the east. They led their people south across the river and into the province of Khorasan, the northeastern territory of the Ghaznavid Empire. The Ghaznavid Sultan, Mas'ud, the son of the great Mahmud, viewed these newcomers with contempt. To him, they were just another band of rough, unkempt nomads, a nuisance to be taxed, hired as occasional mercenaries, or driven back into the wilderness. He saw their raids and skirmishes as a frontier discipline problem, not a strategic threat. He could not have been more wrong. The Seljuks were not just raiding, they were migrating with their entire people, their families, their flocks, their worldly possessions. They were looking for a new home, and they were prepared to fight for it to the death. After years of escalating conflict, Mas'ud decided to assemble the main Ghaznavid army and crush these troublesome nomads once and for all. The two armies met in the spring of 1040 on a desolate, waterless plain near a small outpost called Dandanakan. On paper, it was a terrible mismatch. The Ghaznavid army was a huge, professional, multi-ethnic force. Elite Turkic slave soldiers, heavily armored cavalry, Kurdish and Dalamite infantry, and even a terrifying corps of war elephants. Facing them was the Seljuk horde, a much smaller force composed almost entirely of lightly armored horse archers. But the Seljuks had mobility, discipline, and a perfect understanding of steppe tactics. For several days, they refused to give Mas'ud the pitched battle he wanted. Instead, they swarmed around his lumbering army like angry wasps, launching lightning raids on his supply lines, cutting off his access to wells, and peppering his troops with arrows before melting back into the dust. The heavily armored Ghaznavid soldiers, clad in steel under the hot sun and desperately short of water, were exhausted and demoralized before the main battle even began. When the final confrontation came, the Seljuk horse archers executed a series of feigned retreats, luring the Ghaznavid heavy cavalry into reckless charges, breaking their formations, and picking them off from a distance. The great Ghaznavid army, the conquerors of India, simply disintegrated. The defeat was total and humiliating. Sultan Mas'ud abandoned his treasury, his royal tent, and his army, and fled the field with a handful of bodyguards, a king who had lost his kingdom in a single afternoon. Dandanakan was one of the most decisive battles in the history of the Middle East. The back of Ghaznavid power in Iran was broken forever. They were driven back into Afghanistan and India, never to return. For the Seljuks, the road west was now wide open. The Iranian plateau, with its feuding Buyid princes and its undefended cities, lay before them. Led by Tughril Beg, the Seljuk horsemen swept across Iran with astonishing speed. There was no one left to stop them. The great cities of Persian culture, Nishapur, Rai, Isfahan, opened their gates to the new conquerors. The era of the Dalamite warlords was over. In 1055, Tughril led his army to the gates of Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph, Al-Qaim, was only too happy to be liberated from his Shia Buyid masters by a powerful new Sunni protector. Tughril entered the city not as a destroyer, but as a restorer of Sunni orthodoxy. In a ceremony of immense significance, the Caliph officially received Tughril in his palace. It's a mainstream historical fact that Tughril was the first ruler to be formally invested with the title of Sultan by the Caliph. The word Sultan means authority in Arabic, and this act created a new political framework for the Sunni world. The Caliph would remain the Imam, the spiritual leader of the faith, but the Sultan was now the Emir, the undisputed temporal and military ruler. It was the formal separation of the mosque and the state, a reality that had been developing for centuries, now codified in a single title. A new age had begun. The humble nomadic chieftain, who had once lived in a tent on the steppes, was now the master of an empire, stretching from the edges of Afghanistan to the borders of the Byzantine Empire. The age of petty kings was over, and the great Seljuk Empire now ruled over a unified Iran, bringing with it a new order, a new dynasty, and a new destiny. When the first Seljuk Sultan, Tughril Beg, died without an heir in 1063, the leadership of the vast new empire passed to his nephew, the son of the great commander Chagri. His name was Alp Arslan, which in Turkic means valiant lion, and he was a man who would more than live up to his name. He was the perfect embodiment of a Seljuk ruler, a fearsome warrior who was never more at home than in the saddle, a master of the bow, and a man of simple, devout faith. But he was also wise enough to understand that conquering an empire and governing one were two very different things. The vast, complex, settled society of Iran, with its ancient cities and its sophisticated bureaucracy, could not be run from a war tent. And so, Alp Arslan made one of the most important decisions of his reign. He placed the entire civil administration of the empire into the hands of a Persian genius named Nizam al-Mulk. This appointment established the fundamental partnership that would define the Seljuk state for the next half-century. The military power of the Turkic Sultan and the administrative and cultural power of the Persian vizier. Nizam al-Mulk was more than just a chief minister. He was the true architect of the Seljuk government, a man of immense intellect and foresight who would skillfully manage the empire's finances, establish justice, and promote learning, serving both Alp Arslan and his son after him. With his brilliant vizier running the state, the valiant lion was free to do what he did best: lead his armies and secure the frontiers of his empire. And the most dangerous of those frontiers lay to the west. There, the Seljuk domain now shared a long and volatile border with the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. For centuries, the Byzantines had been the great Christian superpower of the region, a formidable and wealthy state. But now, their eastern provinces in Armenia and Anatolia were suffering from a constant stream of raids. These were carried out by independent bands of Turkoman nomads, cousins of the Seljuks, who were constantly pushing west in search of fresh pastures and plunder for their flocks. For the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, this was an intolerable situation. The emperor at the time was Romanos III Diogenes, a brave and energetic general who had seized the throne with the promise of driving the Turks out of his empire for good. In the year 1071, he assembled a colossal imperial army, a diverse force of Byzantine regulars, Slavic, Frankish, and Norman mercenaries, and Turkic horsemen from other rival tribes, and marched east to seek a final decisive battle. Alp Arslan was taken by surprise. He had been campaigning far to the south, in Syria, when he received the shocking news that a massive Byzantine army was invading his northern territories, with his main infantry force far away. He had to race north with only his elite cavalry, a force that was vastly outnumbered by the approaching enemy. Historians still argue about the exact size of the armies at Manzikert, but all agree that the Byzantine force was significantly larger, making the Seljuk victory a stunning example of superior tactics and discipline. Alp Arslan, recognizing the danger, sent envoys to Romanos seeking a truce. But the emperor, supremely confident in his numbers, dismissed the offer with contempt. He believed he was on the verge of a historic victory that would restore the glory of the Roman Empire. The stage was set for a confrontation on the plains near the fortress town of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. On an August day in 1071, the two armies faced each other. The Byzantine force was a glittering spectacle, a massive wall of heavy infantry and armored cavalry. Facing them, the Seljuk army of mobile horse archers looked small and insignificant. As the battle began, Alp Arslan gave a stirring speech to his men, telling them he was dressed in his burial shroud, ready to die as a martyr for his faith. Then he put his strategy into motion. His horsemen refused to engage in a head-on clash with the superior Byzantine infantry. Instead, they rode in fast, circular formations, showering the enemy with a relentless storm of arrows, and then retreating before the heavy cavalry could catch them. This frustrating dance continued for hours. Finally, in the late afternoon, the Seljuks executed their classic step maneuver, a feigned retreat. The center of their line appeared to break and flee. Believing he had won, Emperor Romanos ordered his army to advance, pressing the attack and breaking their own tight formation. As the Byzantines were drawn deep into the plain, the trap was sprung. The wings of the Seljuk army, which had been hiding in the nearby hills, swept down and enveloped the pursuing enemy. At the same time, the retreating Seljuk center turned and charged. The Byzantine pursuit turned into a panicked retreat, and that retreat turned into a catastrophic rout. To make matters worse, one of Romanos's own commanders betrayed him, pulling his reserve forces off the field and spreading the rumor that the emperor was dead. In the chaos of the setting sun, the great Byzantine army was utterly destroyed. And in the midst of it all, the unthinkable happened. The emperor Romanos IV, wounded and abandoned, was captured alive by Seljuk soldiers. He was brought before Alp Arslan in his tent. In a moment of supreme drama, the Sultan is said to have placed his boot on the neck of the captive Roman emperor, a symbolic gesture of total victory. But after that, he treated his royal prisoner with courtesy, negotiating a peace treaty before releasing him. Alp Arslan had achieved his goal. He had neutralized the Byzantine threat. But the consequences of his victory would go far beyond anything he could have possibly imagined. The Battle of Manzikert did not conquer Anatolia, but it shattered the Byzantine shield that had protected it for 700 years. With the imperial army destroyed and the emperor's authority in tatters due to civil war after his capture, there was no one left to guard the frontier. In the years that followed, the Turkoman tribes, who had previously only raided Anatolia, now migrated into it with their families and flocks, unopposed. The high, grassy plateau was perfect pasture land for their herds. The door to Asia Minor had been kicked open, and a great demographic shift began. The battle had redrawn the map, beginning the long, slow transformation of Greek-speaking Christian Anatolia into the Turkish Muslim land it would one day become. The stunning victory at Manzikert cemented the Seljuk Empire as the new superpower of the Middle East. But the valiant lion, Alp Arslan, would not live to enjoy it for long. Just 1 year later, while campaigning in the east, he was assassinated by a captive fortress commander, and the throne passed to his eldest son, a teenager named Malik Shah Tayyibas. The new sultan was young and relatively inexperienced, and for the entirety of his 20-year reign, the true master of the empire, the architect of its golden age, would be the man his father had trusted, the brilliant Persian vizier, Nizam al-Mulk. The 2 decades that followed, from 1072 to 1092, marked the absolute zenith of the great Seljuk Empire. It was an era of remarkable peace, prosperity, and intellectual ferment, a period when, for a brief and shining moment, a single, stable power stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Central Asia, while Sultan Malik Shah, a great patron of architecture and a passionate hunter, embodied the imperial majesty of the state. It was Nizam al-Mulk who provided its structure and its mind. He was the indispensable man, the grand strategist of governance. His political philosophy is laid out in his famous book, the Siyasatnama, or Book of Government, a masterpiece of political science that he wrote for Malik Shah. It is a practical handbook for a ruler, a guide on how to build a just and enduring state, drawing heavily on the traditions of the ancient Sasanian Shahs and seamlessly blending them with Islamic principles of justice. In its pages, Nizam al-Mulk lays out his vision: the need for a well-organized bureaucracy, a fair and predictable tax system, a powerful army loyal only to the Sultan, and crucially, a vast network of spies and informants to keep the ruler aware of everything happening in his vast domain. He didn't just write about this vision, he built it. He understood that the empire, which had been conquered by nomadic horsemen, needed the infrastructure of a settled civilization to thrive. He undertook a massive program of public works, repairing the ancient royal roads and building hundreds of fortified inns or caravanserais at regular intervals. These provided safe lodging for merchants, pilgrims, and official messengers, stimulating trade and allowing for swift communication across the empire's vast distances. Under his watch, commerce flourished, and the cities of Iran, particularly the new capital of Isfahan, grew into splendid centers of art and industry. This era of stability also fostered a brilliant flourishing of the sciences. In Isfahan, Nizam al-Mulk and Malik Shah established a great astronomical observatory, gathering the finest minds of the age to map the heavens. Among them was a man named Omar Khayyam, while the West would later know him as a poet who wrote melancholy verses about wine and roses. In his own time, Khayyam was celebrated primarily as a genius-level mathematician and astronomer. Working in the Isfahan Observatory, Khayyam and his team were tasked with reforming the calendar. It's a mainstream historical fact that the result, the Jalali calendar, was a work of remarkable scientific precision, calculating the length of the solar year so accurately that it was superior to the Gregorian calendar that Europe would adopt nearly 500 years later. But perhaps Nizam al-Mulk's most lasting and revolutionary achievement was in the field of education. The great ideological rival of the Sunni Seljuk Empire was the Shia Fatimid Caliphate based in Egypt, which sent out waves of skilled missionaries to spread its doctrine. To counter this influence, and to create a class of educated men trained in Sunni theology and law who could serve as loyal judges, administrators, and teachers for his empire, Nizam al-Mulk came up with a brilliant solution. He established a state-sponsored network of universities, or madrasas, across the empire, known as the Nizamiyas in his honor. The most famous of these was the Great Nizamiya of Baghdad, founded in 1065. These were not just local schools, they were endowed institutions with a formal curriculum, salaried professors who were the top scholars of their day, and free tuition, board, and scholarships for students. They were factories for producing the intellectual elite of the Sunni world and the loyal bureaucrats of the Seljuk state. For the first time, the state was taking a direct, systematic role in higher education on a massive scale, an innovation that would influence the development of universities for centuries to come. A young man of talent could now travel to a Nizamiya in Baghdad or Nishapur, receive a world-class education at the state's expense, and then enter into a secure and prestigious career in service of the empire. For a time, the system worked to perfection. The Seljuk Empire under Malik Shah and Nizam al-Mulk was a model of a well-ordered state, a place of safety, commerce, and dazzling intellectual light. But even the most brilliant administrator, with spies in every city, cannot see every shadow. And in the remote mountain fortresses of northern Iran, a new and terrifying threat was gathering, a secretive movement that rejected the Sunni state entirely. They were an organization that would use a new and terrifying political weapon, striking not at armies on the battlefield, but at the very leaders of the empire in their courts and mosques. A threat that would soon bring this golden age to a bloody and abrupt end. The golden age of the Seljuk Empire, so carefully constructed by the brilliant vizier Nizam al-Mulk, was an empire of the plains and the cities. Its power was in its organized bureaucracies, its great universities, its safe trade routes, and its disciplined armies. But while this great power was building its magnificent civilization in the light, a new and entirely different kind of power was being forged in the shadows of the high mountains. It was a movement that saw the Seljuk state not as a protector of the faith, but as a corrupt and illegitimate tyranny. And its leader was a man who would wage war not with armies, but with ideas, terror, and a well-placed dagger. His name was Hassan-i-Sabah. He was a Persian, born in the devout Shia city of Qom, a man of formidable intellect, ascetic discipline, and an unbending messianic will. As a young man, he had converted to Ismaili Shi'ism, a branch of Islam that believed in a line of living, divinely guided imams descended from the Prophet Muhammad. For the Ismailis, the Sunni caliph in Baghdad and his Seljuk protectors were usurpers of the imam's rightful authority. Hassan became a Dari, a secret missionary for the cause, traveling to the Ismaili Fatimid capital in Cairo. But there, he became embroiled in a succession crisis, backing the caliph's elder son, Nizar. When Nizar was passed over and killed, Hassan was forced to flee, a renegade from his own church. He returned to Persia with a new, audacious mission: to lead a revolt in Nizar's name and carve out a new state for his followers, a state that would be a beacon of the true faith in a sea of error. Hassan knew He could not possibly defeat the mighty Seljuk army on the open battlefield. His strategy was entirely different. He would wage a war of asymmetrical warfare, a campaign of psychological terror and targeted assassination. To do this, he needed a base, a headquarters that was utterly secure and beyond the reach of the Sultan's armies. He found it in 1090, in the remote and forbidding Alborz mountains of northern Iran. It was the castle of Alamut, the Eagle's Nest, a fortress perched on a sliver of rock 2,000 meters high, with sheer cliffs on all sides. It was said to be impregnable, and Hassan took it without spilling a single drop of blood. He didn't lay siege to it. Instead, he sent his missionaries into the valley below the castle, and for 2 years they worked in secret, converting the local villagers to the Nizari Ismaili cause. Then they began to convert the soldiers of the garrison, one by one. Finally, Hassan himself snuck into the fortress in disguise. He lived there for some time, his identity a secret, until the moment was right. When he finally revealed himself to the castle's commander, the man found that his authority had evaporated. His soldiers no longer answered to him. They answered to Hassan. Checkmated, the commander had no choice but to accept a payment of 3,000 gold dinars and leave his fortress behind. Alamut now belonged to Hassan Isaba. From this mountain perch, Hassan, who his followers called Sayyidna, our master, ruled his new, invisible kingdom. He lived a famously austere life, sending his own wife and children to a different fortress so as not to be accused of indulgence. He imposed a strict and puritanical law on his followers and established a library that became famous throughout the region. He demanded absolute, unquestioning spiritual and temporal obedience, while their enemies, and later, imaginative European travelers like Marco Polo, would spread lurid tales of secret gardens of paradise and brainwashing followers with hashish, from which the derogatory name Hashishiyin, or assassins, likely derives. Modern historians believe their devotion came not from drugs, but from an absolute and sober religious conviction in their cause. They believed Hassan was the representative of the hidden Imam, and his word was law. From Alamut, Hassan dispatched his most devoted followers, the Fidain, the self-sacrificers. These were his secret agents, trained to be patient, disciplined, and utterly fearless. They would spend months, even years, infiltrating the courts, military camps, and cities of their enemies, working as servants, soldiers, or even adopting the guise of Sufi mystics, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Their goal was to decapitate the Seljuk state by eliminating its key leaders, creating an atmosphere of such paranoia and terror that no official would feel safe. Their campaign began with the most powerful and symbolic target imaginable. In October of 1092, the Grand Vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, the architect of the Seljuk Golden Age, was traveling with his court from Isfahan to Baghdad. As his litter was being carried along the road, a man dressed as a Sufi approached, presenting a petition. As the old vizier leaned forward to accept it, the man pulled out a dagger and plunged it into his heart. Nizam al-Mulk, the most powerful man in the empire, was dead. The assassin was immediately cut down by his guards, but the mission was a shocking success. The murder sent a wave of terror through the entire Islamic world. It was a declaration of war unlike any other. Then, Just 1 month later, Sultan Malik Shah himself died, most likely from illness, though rumors of poison swirled. The two great pillars that had supported the Seljuk state for 2 decades were gone. The empire was immediately plunged into a series of disastrous civil wars between Malik Shah's sons and brothers. The order and stability that Nizam al-Mulk had spent his life building vanished overnight. From his remote eagle's nest, Hassani Sabah had not just killed a man, he had struck a blow that sent the mightiest empire on earth spiraling into chaos. The daggers of the assassins and the quiet hand of fate had, in the space of a few weeks, removed the two pillars that held up the Seljuk world. With the death of the great vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, and the mighty Sultan Malik Shah in the autumn of 1092, the empire was left headless and rudderless. The golden age of peace and order vanished as if it had been a dream, and the empire plunged headfirst into the cold, bitter reality of civil war. Malik Shah had been a strong ruler, but he had failed to designate a clear successor, leaving behind 4 ambitious sons and a powerful widow, all of whom believed the throne was their rightful inheritance. The great Turkic emirs, the provincial governors, and generals who had been kept in check by the Sultan's power were now unleashed, ready to play kingmaker for whichever prince would grant them the most power and wealth. The first move was made by Malik Shah's senior wife, Turkan Khatun, a shrewd and ruthless political operator. She was in the capital, Isfahan, when the Sultan died. She acted quickly, concealing his death for a time, while she had the treasury seized and convinced the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad to proclaim her 4-year-old son, Mahmud, as the new Sultan. But the powerful faction, loyal to the memory of Nizam al-Mulk, the vizier's family, and the vast network of bureaucrats he had trained, despised her. They threw their support behind Malik Shah's eldest son, the 13-year-old Bakiyaruk, and a brutal war of succession began. For more than a decade, the Seljuk Empire became a chessboard for the warring princes and their generals. The brothers Bakiyaruk, Muhammad Tapar, and later the youngest, Sanjar, along with their half-brother Mahmud, fought each other back and forth across the heartlands of Iran and Iraq. Alliances were made and broken overnight. A city that declared for Bakiyaruk 1 month might be besieged and conquered by Muhammad Tapar the next. The great emirs grew rich and powerful by selling their loyalty to the highest bidder, milking the princes for titles and territory. For the common people, it was an unmitigated disaster. The roads that Nizam al-Mulk had made safe were now infested with soldiers and bandits. Fields were burned, irrigation canals were destroyed, and crippling taxes were levied by whichever army happened to be passing through. The well-ordered state of the great vizier had dissolved into a violent scramble for power. Amidst this chaos, a new political institution began to emerge that would seal the empire's fate. It was common practice for a young Seljuk prince to be assigned a guardian, usually a veteran Turkic commander, who would act as his tutor and protector. This guardian was known by the Turkic title Atabeg, which means Father Lord. In the stable era of Malik Shah, this was just an honorific. But now, with the princes being mere children and the central government in a state of collapse, these Atabegs began to wield the real power. An Atabeg would govern a province in the name of his young ward, but the prince was his puppet. The Atabeg would command the army, collect the taxes, and run the administration. Soon, they began making their positions hereditary, founding their own local dynasties. The fragmentation of the empire was now institutionalized. This internal weakness had devastating external consequences. It's a mainstream historical fact that the surprising success of the First Crusade was largely due to the political vacuum in the region. When the armies of the European Knights marched into Syria and Palestine in 1097, they did not face a unified imperial response. The local Seljuk governors of cities like Antioch and Aleppo were on their own. They sent desperate pleas for help to the warring sultans, Barkiaruk and Muhammad Tapar. But the brothers were too consumed with fighting each other in Persia to spare any significant forces to deal with a strange new enemy in a distant province. Had the Crusaders arrived just a decade earlier, they would have been met and annihilated by the unified might of Malik Shah's grand army. Instead, they found a land divided, and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, capturing Jerusalem in 1099. By the early 12th century, the fratricidal wars finally burned themselves out, but the great unified empire of Malik Shah was gone forever. It had been partitioned. The main line of sultans, known as the Great Seljuks of Iraq and Persia, now ruled a much reduced territory in the west, their authority constantly challenged by powerful Atabegs. Separate, independent Seljuk dynasties ruled in southern Persia and in Anatolia. The Sultanate of Rum, the only semblance of the old imperial glory, was found in the east. There, the last of Malik Shah's sons, Sultan Sanjar, had spent the long years of civil war consolidating his rule over the vast province of Khorasan. He was a capable and powerful ruler who would eventually be recognized as the senior, great sultan of the dynasty. But even he could not put the pieces of his father's empire back together again. The Seljuk eagle, once so mighty, had broken apart, its children now ruling over the scattered fragments of its former glory. In the aftermath of the Seljuk Empire's slow fragmentation, a new power had risen to dominate the East. They were the Khwarazm Shahs, rulers of a vast but brittle new empire. Originally governors for the Seljuks, they had asserted their independence and, under the ambitious and prideful Shah Ala al-Din Muhammad II, had conquered a massive territory stretching from India to Anatolia. By the early 13th century, the Khwarezmian Shah was the most powerful monarch in the Islamic world, and he knew it. His army was enormous, his treasury was full, and his arrogance was boundless. He saw himself as a new Alexander, the master of all he surveyed. What he did not know was that far to the east, beyond the great mountains and deserts, a power was consolidating that would make his own look like a child's sandcastle before a tidal wave. On the high steppe of Mongolia, a chieftain named Temujin had accomplished the impossible. He had united the feuding, nomadic tribes into a single, disciplined, and utterly lethal military nation. He had taken the title of Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, and had forged his people into an instrument of conquest, unlike anything the world had ever seen. After subjugating the peoples of the steppe and conquering northern China, the Mongol Empire now shared a border with the lands of the Khwarezm Shah. In 1218, the Khan sent a vast trade caravan, hundreds of merchants with 500 camels laden with gold, silver, silks, and jade to the Khwarezmian frontier city of Otrar. With it, he sent a message to Shah Muhammad, seeking a treaty of peace and commerce as an equal. He wrote, am the Khan of the lands of the rising sun, and you are the Sultan of those of the setting sun. Let us conclude a firm treaty of friendship. But the governor of Otrar was a greedy and suspicious man. Seeing the immense wealth of the caravan, he accused the merchants of being Mongol spies, arrested them, and sent a message to the Shah asking for instructions. Shah Muhammad, in an act of catastrophic folly, gave his consent. The governor executed the entire caravan and seized its goods. Genghis Khan's reaction was one of cold, controlled fury. He was a pragmatist who valued trade and protected merchants. But more than that, he held the lives of ambassadors and envoys to be sacred. He made one last attempt at a diplomatic solution, sending 3 envoys to the Shah's court to demand that the governor of Otrar be handed over for punishment. Shah Muhammad's response was the single greatest mistake of his life. He had the chief ambassador executed. He then had the beards of the other 2 shaved off, a sign of profound humiliation, and send them back to deliver their colleague's head to their master. When the envoys returned and presented their grisly message, the die was cast. The Shah had not just murdered a few merchants, he had broken the most sacred laws of nations and had personally insulted the great Khan. The Mongol response would be total war. In 1219, Genghis Khan unleashed his hordes. It was not a raid. It was a meticulously planned invasion, a storm of vengeance on a continental scale. The Shah, despite having a much larger army, made another fatal error. Instead of gathering his forces for a decisive battle, he distributed them in garrisons across his great cities, hoping to bog the Mongols down in a series of long sieges. It was a disastrous miscalculation. The Mongols, masters of speed and maneuver, simply bypassed cities that were too strong, isolating and destroying the garrisons one by one. Using intelligence gathered from merchants and a network of spies, they moved with terrifying speed. They were not just a horde of horsemen. They were a sophisticated military machine, employing captured Chinese engineers to build siege engines, catapults, battering rams, and trebuchets that could bring down the walls of any city. The great ancient cities of Transoxiana, centers of Islamic civilization for 500 years, were the first to fall. Otrar was besieged, and when it fell, its treacherous governor was captured, and according to the chronicles, executed, may having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. The jewel of the East, Bukhara, was next. Genghis Khan himself rode his horse into its great mosque, threw the copies of the Quran to the ground to be trampled by his horses, and from the pulpit declared himself to be the scourge of God, sent to punish a sinful people. The city was sacked and burned, its population either massacred or enslaved, and driven ahead of the Mongol army to be used as human shields in the next siege. The magnificent city of Samarkand suffered a similar fate. The horror then swept into Khorasan, the heartland of Persian culture. The city of Nishapur, which dared to resist and killed Genghis Khan's son-in-law in the fighting, was subjected to a methodical annihilation. After its fall, the Mongols, under the command of the Khan's brutal son Tolui, are said to have spent days massacring every man, woman, and child, building grotesque pyramids of their skulls as a warning to others. Historians still argue about the exact death tolls, which was certainly exaggerated by chroniclers to emphasize the horror. But the archaeological evidence confirms a catastrophic demographic collapse from which some regions would not recover for centuries. The destruction was not just human, but ecological. The Mongols deliberately destroyed the delicate underground irrigation canals, the qanats, that had made the land fertile for millennia, turning vast swaths of farmland back into barren desert. And what of the Shah, the man whose arrogance had unleashed this apocalypse? He never once stood to fight. He fled from city to city, his nerve broken, his empire collapsing behind him. The Mongols sent their finest generals, the brilliant Jebe and Subutai, in pursuit, chasing him across his own kingdom like a hunted animal. Finally, broken and abandoned by his own men, Shah Muhammad II took refuge on a tiny, desolate island in the Caspian Sea, where he died of pleurisy, a destitute fugitive, leaving the ruins of his once great empire to the fury of the storm he had invited. The great Mongol storm of Genghis Khan had passed like a hurricane, leaving Iran shattered, depopulated, and in a state of political anarchy. The great Khan himself had withdrawn to the east, his vengeance satisfied, leaving behind only military garrisons to watch over the ruins. In the decades that followed, Iran was a land adrift. The heroic son of the last Khwarazm Shah, Jalal al-Din, waged a valiant but doomed guerrilla war against the invaders, but he was eventually defeated. For nearly 30 years, there was no central power, only a collection of local princes and potentates who paid tribute to the distant Mongol capital of Karakoram, all living in the shadow of the terror that had been unleashed. But this was merely a lull. The Mongols were not finished with the lands of the West. In the 1250s, the new great Khan, Mongke, a grandson of Genghis, decided it was time to finish the conquest. He gave his brother, Kublai, the task of subjugating the rest of China. To his other brother, Hulagu, he gave a different mission: to march west with a colossal army, a nation on the move, and bring the entirety of the Middle East under the permanent rule of the Mongol Empire. Hulagu's orders were precise and chilling. First, he was to destroy the mountain fortresses of the Nizari Ismailis, the assassins, who had dared to threaten the Mongols. Second, he was to subdue all the local rulers who had not yet submitted. And third, he was to demand the final submission of the most prestigious ruler in all of Islam, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Hulagu's army was not a raid. It was a slow, methodical, unstoppable steamroller. He moved west with perhaps the largest single Mongol army ever assembled, a force of well over 100,000 men, complete with their families, their herds, and 1,000 teams of Chinese siege engineers who were masters of building giant catapults and trebuchets. Hulagu was a prince of the royal blood, and he was coming not just to conquer, but to rule. His first target was the state within a state that Hassan-i-Sabah had founded a century and a half earlier. The assassins, from their network of impregnable mountain castles, had watched the first Mongol invasion with interest, but now the storm was coming for them. Hulagu's army systematically surrounded their strongholds in the Alborz Mountains, the fortresses that had resisted Seljuk sultans for generations were now faced with terrifying new siege weapons that could hurl enormous rocks against their walls. The Ismaili Imam, a young and indecisive man named Rukn al-Din Kursha, quickly lost his nerve. Hoping to save himself and his people, he surrendered to Hulegu. The Mongol Khan then used him as a pawn, forcing him to send messages to all his other castle commanders, ordering them to give up their fortresses without a fight. One by one, the legendary strongholds, including the Eagle's Nest of Alamut itself, opened their gates. The great Persian historian Juvaini, who was in Hulegu's entourage, was granted permission to inspect Alamut's famous library before it was put to the torch, saving a number of valuable books and scientific instruments from the flames. But this was a rare act of preservation. Once the castles were emptied, the Mongols systematically demolished them, tearing down the walls and filling in the wells, ensuring they could never be used again. When the Imam Khursha was no longer of any use, Hulegu had him and his entire retinue of followers executed. The Nizari Ismaili state in Persia, which had terrorized the kings and viziers of the Middle East for 150 years, was utterly and permanently erased from existence. With the assassins destroyed, Hulegu turned his sights on the ultimate prize, Baghdad. The city was a shadow of its former glory, but it was still a vast metropolis and, more importantly, the symbolic heart of the Sunni Islamic world. It was the home of the Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mustasim, the 37th in a line stretching back 500 years. Hulegu sent an ultimatum, demanding that the Caliph come before him, submit, and demolish the city's outer walls. The Caliph, a weak and vacillating man, surrounded by sycophantic advisors, made the fatal mistake of responding with arrogance. He refused to submit, boasting that if he were attacked, the entire Muslim world, from east to west, would rise to his defense. He had no idea that the Muslim world was in no position to help, and that he was facing an enemy who did not make idle threats. In January of 1258, Hulegu's horde appeared before the walls of Baghdad. The Mongol army, divided into several corps, surrounded the ancient city. Their siege engines began a relentless bombardment, and within 2 weeks, the city's defenses were breached. The Caliph, realizing the horror he had unleashed, tried to negotiate, but it was far too late. Hulegu was in no mood for mercy. The city was given over to a week of unrestrained slaughter and destruction. Palaces, hospitals, and mosques were burned to the ground. The city's greatest treasures, its libraries, including the legendary House of Wisdom, were utterly destroyed. Chroniclers wrote that the Tigris River ran black with the ink from countless thousands of manuscripts thrown into its waters. The Caliph and his surviving sons were captured. The Mongols, who held a religious taboo against shedding royal blood directly onto the earth, had their own method for such occasions. Al-Mustasim was brought before Hulegu, who mockingly told the Caliph to eat his gold, since he had prized it more than the lives of his subjects. Then, the last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad was wrapped in a carpet, and he and his sons were trampled to death by the hooves of Mongol horses. With that brutal final act, the 500-year-old Abbasid Caliphate was extinguished forever. The sack of Baghdad was a psychic blow to the Islamic world, a cataclysm that marked the definitive end of an age. The old world was now a smoldering ruin, and upon its ashes, Hulagu Khan was about to build a new one. The fires of Baghdad had cooled, and the last Abbasid caliph was a ghost. Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, was the undisputed master of a shattered world. From the borders of Syria to the banks of the Oxus River, the old powers had been swept from the board. Now, Hulagu and his Mongol princes faced a challenge for which their entire history as nomadic warriors had left them unprepared. How to govern? It is one thing to conquer a civilization from the saddle. It is another thing entirely to rule it. On the ashes of the old world, a new state was born, the Ilkhanate. The title Hulagu took, Ilkhan, meant subordinate Khan, a nod to his theoretical allegiance to his brother, the great Khan Kublai, who now ruled the vast Mongol Empire from his new capital in China. But in practice, the Ilkhanate of Persia was its own powerful and deeply troubled kingdom. The central problem was the immense, seemingly unbridgeable gulf between the rulers and the ruled. The Mongol elite were a foreign military aristocracy. They continued to live a semi-nomadic life, moving between summer and winter pastures in their great encampments, or ordos. They spoke a different language, followed their own ancient legal code, the Yasa of Genghis Khan, and practiced their traditional faith, a mixture of shamanism and worship of the eternal sky god, Tengri. For them, the purpose of this new territory was simple: to provide the pasture lands and tax revenues necessary to support their armies and their lavish, itinerant courts. They were conquerors, and they viewed their new subjects, whom they dismissively called Tajiks, with the contempt of a warrior for a farmer. For the Persian population, the trauma of the invasion gave way to the harsh reality of occupation. These new masters were aliens in every sense of the word. They were a non-Muslim minority ruling over a vast Muslim majority. Their laws were strange, their customs barbaric, and their economic policies ruinous. The early decades of Ilkhanid rule were a period of rapacious and chaotic exploitation. Mongol governors, or darugachi, were installed in every city, tasked with extracting the maximum possible tribute. The tax system was a confusing and brutal mess of Mongol poll taxes, Islamic land taxes, and a host of other arbitrary duties. The burden on the peasantry, who had already seen their fields and irrigation canals destroyed, was crushing. Any hope of economic recovery was stifled by the relentless demands of the new regime. It was becoming clear that a strategy of smash and grab was not a sustainable model of government. Slowly, and out of sheer necessity, the Mongols began to realize what every conqueror of Persia before them had discovered. You could not run this ancient, complex society without the Persians themselves. It's a mainstream historical fact that despite their military supremacy, the Mongols were entirely dependent on the native Persian bureaucracy to manage the intricate financial and civil administration of the Ilkhanate. This created a powerful but often vulnerable class of Persian men of the pen, who were recruited to bring order to the chaos. The most prominent of these were two brothers from a noble family, the Juvainis. One brother, Atta Malik, was the great historian who chronicled the Mongol conquest. The other, Shams al-Din, became the Sahib Divan, or chief minister, serving Hulagu and his successor. For men like Shams al-Din Juvayni, it was a dangerous and thankless task. They were walking a razor's edge. They had to serve their often brutal and demanding Mongol masters, implementing their harsh tax policies while simultaneously trying to mitigate the worst of the damage, protect their fellow countrymen, and slowly rebuild the shattered infrastructure of the state. They were attempting a quiet, internal conquest to civilize the conquerors, to introduce them to the Persian arts of statecraft, and to bring some semblance of predictable governance to the realm. A single misstep, a hint of corruption, or the jealousy of a rival Mongol noble could lead to disgrace, torture, and execution. The religious landscape added another layer of tension. In keeping with Mongol tradition, the early Ilkhans, like Hulagu and his son Abaka, were officially tolerant of all faiths. But Hulagu's mother and his chief wife were both devout Nestorian Christians, and the court was filled with Christian and Buddhist advisors. This meant that while the Muslim majority felt oppressed, other minorities often found favor. For the first time in centuries, Christian churches and Buddhist temples were being openly built and patronized by the rulers in the heart of Iran. This religious favoritism, combined with the economic hardship, deepened the resentment of the local population, who saw their faith, their culture, and their prosperity all under assault. And so, the new Ilkhanate stumbled into existence as a deeply schizophrenic state. It was a kingdom at war with itself, a nomadic Mongol military machine awkwardly bolted onto the chassis of a sophisticated, ancient, and deeply wounded Persian civilization. The conquerors struggled to become rulers, while the conquered struggled to survive. The fundamental question remained unanswered. Would the Ilkhans succeed in turning Iran into just another province of a vast pagan Mongol empire? Or would the resilient, patient culture of Persia somehow find a way to absorb and transform them, as it had done with so many conquerors before? The future of the nation depended on the answer. For 4 decades, the Mongol Ilkhanate had been a kingdom at war with its own soul. The conquerors and the conquered lived in two separate worlds, divided by language, by law, and most profoundly, by faith. The state was bankrupt, the land is exhausted, and the endless infighting between rival Mongol princes had brought the realm to the brink of total collapse. By the end of the 13th century, it seemed that the House of Hulagu, built on such terrifying military might, was destined to crumble into dust. But then, a new ruler came to the throne, a man who would not only save the Ilkhanate, but completely transform it. His name was Ghazan. Ghazan, a great-grandson of Hulagu, did not inherit his throne peacefully. He had to seize it in a civil war in 1295. To secure his victory, he made a strategic and world-altering bargain. He sought the allegiance of a powerful and devoutly Muslim Mongol emir named Nauruz. Nauruz agreed to support him, but on one condition: if they were victorious, Ghazan must abandon the faith of his ancestors and embrace Islam. Ghazan agreed, and so, on the eve of his final victory, Ghazan Khan, in a great public ceremony, formally declared his conversion to Sunni Islam. He and his entire army recited the Declaration of Faith, and with that single act, the great chasm that had separated the Mongol rulers from their Persian subjects was finally bridged. This conversion was the most important event in the history of the Ilkhanate. It was a political masterstroke that instantly legitimized Mongol rule in a way that generations of conquest never could. The ruler was no longer a foreign, pagan overlord. He was a Muslim sultan a protector of the faith. Ghazan symbolically cast off the title of Ilkhan and styled himself Sultan Ghazan Mahmud. The era of Mongol cultural aloofness was over. Buddhist temples that had been built under his predecessors were destroyed, and Islam was declared the state religion. The Mongol conquerors were, at last, being conquered themselves by the powerful and resilient culture of Persia. But conversion alone could not fix a broken state. Ghazan was a man of fierce intelligence and restless energy, and he knew his kingdom was dying. To be his partner in the monumental task of rebuilding it, he chose one of the most brilliant minds of the age, a Persian physician and statesman named Rashid al-Din Fazl Allah. Rashid al-Din, a man of Jewish heritage who had converted to Islam, was a polymath of genius, and he became Ghazan's Grand Vizier. Together, these two men, the iron-willed Mongol Sultan and the visionary Persian administrator, launched a sweeping series of reforms designed to pull the state back from the abyss. Their first and most urgent task was to fix the economy. They completely overhauled the rapacious and chaotic tax system. Detailed land surveys were carried out across the country, and for the first time, a fixed, predictable land tax was established. The arbitrary levies and the corruption of tax collectors were stamped out. For the peasantry, this meant a measure of security they had not known for a century. For the state, it meant a stable, reliable income. They also reformed the currency, standardized weights and measures, and rebuilt the YAM, the Mongol postal and relay station system, which revitalized communication and long-distance trade. To discipline the army, Ghazan reformed military pay, granting soldiers fixed land assignments, or ikta, to support them, ending the destructive practice of letting them live off the civilian population. He also revived the authority of Islamic Sharia law in civil matters, winning the support of the religious establishment. This newfound stability and enlightened patronage ushered in a second, unexpected golden age for Iran. The capital city of Tabriz was transformed by Ghazan and Rashid al-Din into a magnificent international hub of commerce and culture, a city of splendid mosques, hospitals, and observatories. And it was here that one of the greatest intellectual projects of the medieval world was undertaken. It is a mainstream historical fact that Rashid al-Din's Jami al-Tawarikh, or Compendium of Chronicles, commissioned by Ghazan, was the first major attempt at writing a genuine world history. Taking advantage of the vast reach of the Mongol Empire, which connected China to Europe, Rashid al-Din assembled a team of scholars from across the known world. His book contained not just the history of the Persians and the Mongols, but detailed accounts of the history of the Chinese, the Indians, the Franks of Europe, and the Jews. To produce this masterpiece and other works, he established a great academic complex in Tabriz called the Rab-e-Rashidi, a scriptorium and university where books were copied, translated, and illustrated by teams of scribes and artists. Under the guidance of Ghazan Khan and Rashid al-Din, the Ilkhanate was reborn. It was no longer a Mongol military camp occupying a foreign land. It had become a sophisticated, prosperous, and culturally brilliant Perso-Islamic Sultanate. The destructive energy of the steppe had finally been channeled into the constructive arts of civilization. The fusion of Mongol power and Persian culture produced a period of astonishing artistic creativity, especially in the arts of the book, with exquisite miniature paintings that blended Chinese and Persian styles. But this remarkable revival was the work of two exceptionally brilliant men. The great question that hung over the glittering court of Tabriz was whether this new order could survive them. The brilliant reforms of Ghazan Khan and his vizier Rashid al-Din had saved the Ilkhanate from an early death, transforming it from a military occupation into a functioning Perso-Islamic state. But the new order they created was fragile, heavily dependent on the force of will of a strong ruler. When Ghazan died of illness in 1304, the great question was whether his achievements would endure, or whether the old chaotic habits of the Mongol nobility would reassert themselves. For a time, it seemed the golden age would continue. Ghazan's brother and successor, Oljetu, was a great patron of the arts and architecture, and he largely continued his brother's policies, with Rashid al-Din still serving as the indispensable Grand Vizier. Oljetu's reign is best remembered for his magnificent new capital city, Sultaniyye. Here, he oversaw the construction of one of the wonders of the medieval world, his own mausoleum, a colossal structure with a soaring turquoise-tiled dome that remains one of the largest brick domes on Earth. It was a statement of imperial power and piety, a fusion of Mongol and Persian traditions. Oljetu's own religious journey mirrored the Ilkhanat's deepening integration into its new homeland. He had been baptized a Christian in his youth, then converted to Sunni Islam with his brother, and finally, late in his reign, he embraced Shia Islam, a move that caused considerable tension, but showed just how far the Mongol rulers had traveled from the shamanism of the steppes. When Oljetu died in 1316, he was succeeded by his young son, Abu Sa'id. It was under this new, young Khan that the political fault lines began to crack. The great Mongol emirs, the heads of the powerful noble clans, had long been jealous of the immense power of the Persian vizier, Rashid al-Din. Now, with a boy on the throne, they saw their chance. In a classic story of courtly intrigue, they poisoned the young ruler's mind against the elderly statesman who had served his father and uncle so faithfully. Historians still argue whether the charges of poison against Rashid al-Din had any merit or were simply a pretext for jealous rivals to eliminate the most powerful man in the kingdom. In 1318, the great vizier, the man who had written the world's first universal history and rescued an empire from collapse, was falsely convicted of treason and executed, along with his young son. It was a tragic end and a dark omen for the future of the Ilkhanate. Abu Sa'id grew into a capable ruler, and for the nearly 2 decades of his reign, he managed to hold the fraying empire together. He signed a final peace treaty with the Mamluks of Egypt, ending a long and costly war, and he managed to keep the rival Mongol nobles in check. But the internal rivalries were only simmering beneath the surface, waiting for his strong hand to be removed. And in 1335, it was. Abu Sa'id died suddenly, possibly of the plague, without leaving a son or a clear heir. With his death, the last effective ruler of the House of Hulegu was gone, and the Ilkhanate fell from a cliff. The collapse was immediate and total. The great Mongol amirs, from powerful clans like the Chupanids and the Jalayirids, immediately began fighting over the carcass of the state. They dragged various obscure descendants of Hulagu out of obscurity, placed them on the throne as puppet khans, and then went to war with each other in their name. The unified Ilkhanate, which had ruled Iran for 80 years, ceased to exist in a depressingly familiar pattern, repeating the collapse of the Seljuk Empire 2 centuries earlier. Iran once again dissolved into a chaotic mosaic of rival successor states. The Jalayirids, a Mongol dynasty, seized control of Iraq and Azerbaijan, ruling from Baghdad. The Chupanids held sway for a time in the northwest. The Muzaffarids, a Persian dynasty, carved out a kingdom for themselves in the south, in the region of Fars and Isfahan, and in the east, in Khorasan, a unique and radical Shia movement known as the Sabadars, or Heads on the Gallows, established a populist republic. As if this endless political violence were not enough, a far more terrible scourge arrived in the midst of the chaos. The Black Death, which had been carried west from Asia along the Mongol trade routes, swept into Iran in the late 1340s. The pandemic moved through a population already weakened by war and famine, killing a staggering percentage of the population and delivering a final, devastating blow to the already crippled economy and social fabric. By the middle of the 14th century, the great Mongol experiment in Iran was over. The legacy of Genghis Khan's conquest had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, dissolving into a squabbling collection of warlords ruling over a plague-stricken and desolate land. The country was broken, leaderless, and bleeding from 1,000 wounds. And in this brutal, violent world, a new and terrible power was beginning to stir. Just beyond the borders, in the war-torn lands of Transoxiana, a man was coming who would claim the legacy of Genghis Khan as his own, and who would seek to unite this shattered world once more through a campaign of conquest even more terrifying than the last. The world of the late 14th century was a landscape of ruins. The great Ilkhanate had disintegrated, leaving behind a power vacuum filled with the squabbling of petty kings and ambitious generals. The land was exhausted, the population decimated by plague, and the dream of a unified, stable Iran seemed to have died forever. It was into this broken world, a world crying out for either a savior or a final destroyer, that a new and terrible conqueror arose. He was a man who would surpass even the Mongols in the sheer scale of his conquests and the calculated artistry of his cruelty. His name was Timur. We know him in the West as Tamerlane, a corruption of his Persian nickname Timur-i-Lang, which means Timur the Lame. The name was literal. As a young man, he had suffered severe wounds to his right leg and right arm, leaving him with a permanent dragging limp and a stiffened hand for the rest of his life. But this physical impairment was cruelly deceptive. It housed a spirit of boundless ambition, a will of unbreakable iron, and a mind of pure strategic genius. He was born in the 1330s near the great city of Samarkand, into a minor noble family of the Barlas, a Turco-Mongol tribe. It's a mainstream historical fact that Timur was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, which meant he could never take the title of Khan himself. Instead, he ruled with the title of Amir, commander, and married a princess of the Genghisid line to legitimize his reign. He was a devout Muslim, a student of history, and an admirer of fine architecture. Yet he would become one of the most prolific destroyers of human life the world has ever known. His early life was a masterclass in survival and opportunism in a chaotic age. He was a minor warlord, a mercenary, at times even a cattle rustler and a bandit, playing one faction against another in the war-torn lands of Transoxiana. Through a brilliant and utterly ruthless combination of battlefield victories, cunning diplomacy, and treacherous betrayals, he methodically eliminated every one of his rivals. By 1370, he had made himself the undisputed master of the region. He declared the magnificent and ancient city of Samarkand his capital, and from there he launched a series of military campaigns that would not cease until his death 35 years later. His goal was nothing less than the restoration of the Mongol Empire of his idol, Genghis Khan. He turned his gaze first towards the fractured lands of Iran. In a series of massive campaigns, he swept down from the north, picking off the squabbling successor states one by one: the Sabadars in Khorasan, the Muzaffarids in Isfahan and Shiraz, the Jalayirids in Baghdad. All were crushed by his unstoppable war machine. But it was the method of his conquests that struck a new kind of terror into the hearts of men. Timur had perfected the use of calculated, systematic terror as an instrument of policy. His procedure was brutally simple. When his army arrived before a city, he would offer terms: surrender, pay tribute, and you will be spared. If the city resisted, or worse, if it surrendered and then later rebelled, his vengeance was absolute and designed to be unforgettable. After his forces took the city of Isfahan in 1387, a rebellion broke out, and the city's inhabitants killed his tax collectors. In response, Timur ordered a general massacre. His soldiers were commanded to each bring back a quota of severed heads. Chroniclers report that these were then meticulously counted and built into more than 28 gruesome towers outside the city walls, a monument of bone and decaying flesh, visible for miles. It was a message, written in the language of horror, to every other city in his path. This is the price of defiance. This was not the act of a mindless savage. It was the cold, deliberate policy of a conqueror who understood that fear could travel faster than any army. Yet, this is only one half of the paradox of Timur. As his armies destroyed cities, he would often command that the finest artisans, the architects, the tile makers, the calligraphers, the scholars, and the metalworkers be spared from the slaughter. They would be rounded up and forcibly marched, sometimes thousands of miles, back to his capital. He was systematically draining the entire world of its talent and funneling it into one place. He used the mountains of plunder from his campaigns and the genius of these captive artists to transform Samarkand into the glittering jewel of the world. He built colossal mosques with towering minarets and vast domes tiled in a brilliant, shimmering turquoise blue. He laid out magnificent gardens and erected palaces of breathtaking beauty. He was the destroyer of 100 cities and the builder of one. By the dawn of the 15th century, the lame warlord who had started as a minor bandit was the master of all of Iran, Iraq, and Central Asia. He had brought unity to the land once more, but it was the unity of a graveyard, a peace born of absolute terror. And the world conqueror's ambition was far from satisfied. His devastating gaze was already turning to new horizons, to India, to the Ottoman Empire, and beyond. The empire of Timur the Lame, forged in terror and built on foundations of bone, seemed destined to collapse the moment its terrifying creator was gone. In 1405, while on the march to conquer China, the old world conqueror died, and his vast domain was immediately plunged into a predictable and bloody war between his sons and grandsons. For a few years, it seemed that Timur's only legacy would be one of destruction. But out of this chaos, one of his sons, his fourth son, Shah Rukh, emerged as the victor. And with his victory, the character of the empire changed completely. It was as if a raging storm had suddenly given way to a calm and luminous dawn. Shah Rukh was the absolute antithesis of his father. Where Timur had been a restless, nomadic warrior who lived for the battlefield, Shah Rukh was a pious, peace-loving intellectual who preferred the library to the war tent. He was a builder, not a destroyer, a man who sought to heal the wounds his father had inflicted on the world. One of his first and most significant acts was to move the primary capital of the empire from Timur's grandiose Samarkand to the great city of Herat in Khorasan. Under Shah Rukh's long and stable reign, and the patronage of his brilliant wife, Queen Gauhar Shad, Herat was transformed into the cultural and intellectual capital of the Islamic world, a city whose artistic splendor rivaled that of Florence during the Italian Renaissance. This spectacular flourishing of culture is known as the Timurid Renaissance, and Queen Gauhar Shad was one of its greatest architects. She was a woman of immense influence and impeccable taste, and she commissioned some of the most beautiful buildings in the history of Islamic art. A grand mosque complex in the holy city of Mashhad, and her mosque and madrasa in Herat were masterpieces of Timurid architecture, famed for their perfect proportions and, above all, their breathtaking tilework. Artists in her workshops perfected the art of mosaic faience, creating intricate patterns of cobalt blue, turquoise, and gold that shimmered on the surfaces of the great domes and minarets. It was in the Timurid court workshops, or kitabkhanas, that the supreme art form of the age was brought to its zenith, the art of the book. Wealthy princes and nobles commissioned lavishly illustrated manuscripts of the great works of Persian literature, like Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, or the romantic epics of the poet Nizami. In these workshops, the greatest masters of the era, calligraphers, illuminators, bookbinders, and painters, collaborated to create single volumes that were masterpieces of collective genius. The style of miniature painting that blossomed in Herat is one of the glories of world art. These were small, jewel-like paintings of incredible delicacy and vibrant color, depicting scenes of courtly life, epic battles, or tragic lovers in idealized lyrical landscapes. The work of the great master of this school, Kamal ud Din Behzad, is famed for its complex compositions, its subtle psychological portraits, and its harmonious and dreamlike beauty. While Shah Rukh and Gauhar Shad were cultivating this artistic paradise in Herat, another great Timurid mind was at work in the old capital of Samarkand. Shah Rukh's own son, Ulugh Beg, was a prince who was a scientist at heart. He was a reluctant governor, far more fascinated by the movements of the stars than the movements of armies. Using the vast wealth at his disposal, Ulugh Beg pursued his true passion, astronomy. In the 1420s, he constructed a great observatory in Samarkand, an institution that was, for its time, the most advanced center for studying the heavens in the world. Its main instrument was a marvel of engineering, a colossal Fakhri sextant, an enormous arc of smooth marble, 60 feet high, built inside a deep trench. Using this and other instruments, Ulugh Beg and his team of astronomers set about mapping the sky with a precision that was simply unprecedented. The result of their decades of work was the Sij-e-Sultani, a star catalogue and set of astronomical tables that was a landmark of medieval science. It is a mainstream historical fact that Ulugh Beg's star catalogue was the most significant work of observational astronomy in the centuries between Ptolemy and Copernicus, and its accuracy was not surpassed in Europe for over 150 years. He was a prince who sought not to conquer the earth, but to measure the heavens. For nearly half a century, under the wise and peaceful rule of Shah Rukh, this incredible cultural and scientific flowering was allowed to blossom. It was a precious, luminous moment, a time when artists and scientists were the heroes of the age. But this renaissance, for all its brilliance, was built on a fragile foundation. The Timurids had inherited their founder's ambition, but also his dynasty's fatal flaw, the habit of fratricidal warfare. Ulugh Beg, the genius astronomer, was a weak and ineffectual politician. He was ultimately overthrown and murdered by his own rebellious son. When Shah Rukh himself died in 1447, the unifying force that had held the empire together was gone, and his descendants immediately fell to fighting amongst themselves for the throne. The great empire began to crumble once more, a sad reminder that these golden ages of peace and art are often just brief, beautiful interludes in a much harsher story. The brilliant light of the Timurid Renaissance in Herat cast long shadows, while the descendants of Timur were busy patronizing painters and astronomers in the east. The vast western territories of their empire, the lands of Azerbaijan, Iraq, and western Iran, were slipping from their grasp. The death of Shah Rukh had shattered the unity of the Timurid realm, and into this power vacuum rode two formidable new powers, a pair of rival tribal confederations who would battle for supremacy for over half a century. They were the Kara Koyunlu and the Ak Koyunlu, better known to history by the simple, evocative translations of their Turkic names, the Black Sheep and the White Sheep. These were Turkmen, nomadic or semi-nomadic Turkic peoples who had been a major presence in the region for centuries. Their power was not in ancient cities or sophisticated bureaucracies, but in the saddle. They were masters of cavalry warfare, organized into vast and mobile tribal clans. Historians are not entirely certain about the origins of their names, but it is widely believed that the Black Sheep and White Sheep refer to the totemic animals on their banners, or perhaps the predominant color of the great flocks of sheep that formed the basis of their nomadic wealth and identity. The first to rise to prominence were the Black Sheep. They had consolidated their power in the lands around Azerbaijan and eastern Anatolia. Under their charismatic and resilient leader, Kara Yusuf, they threw off the yoke of their former masters and even challenged Timur himself. The great world conqueror defeated Kara Yusuf repeatedly, forcing him into exile. But like a stubborn weed, he always came back. The moment Timur died, Kara Yusuf returned and swiftly reconquered his lands, even capturing the ancient city of Baghdad. The Black Sheep were now a major empire. Their greatest ruler was Jahan Shah, a brutal and ambitious conqueror. He expanded the Black Sheep Empire to its greatest extent, even briefly managing to capture the Timurid capital of Herat. But like many fearsome warriors, he also had a taste for beauty. In his own capital, Tabriz, he commissioned one of the great masterpieces of Persian architecture, the Blue Mosque, a building famed for its stunning and intricate turquoise and cobalt blue tile work. But wherever the Black Sheep extended their power, they were met by the fierce opposition of their hereditary rivals, the White Sheep. The White Sheep Confederation had its heartland slightly to the west of their rivals, centered on the great fortress city of Diyarbakir. For much of the early 15th century, they were the weaker of the two powers, often forced to bide their time and acknowledge the supremacy of their foes. But the rivalry was relentless, a constant, simmering feud that would often break out into open warfare. The entire region became their chessboard, and the lives of the settled people in the great cities like Tabriz were dictated by which of the two sheep banners flew over their walls. For decades, the two confederations were locked in a violent stalemate. It was an age of raids and counter-raids, of shifting alliances and betrayals, a classic tribal struggle for dominance played out on an imperial scale. But in the middle of the century, the White Sheep found a leader who would transform them from underdogs into champions. His name was Uzun Hassan, or Hassan the Tall. He was a brilliant military strategist, a master of diplomacy, and a man with the charisma to unite the fractious White Sheep clans into a single, disciplined force. He spent the first years of his reign consolidating his own power base, preparing for the inevitable final showdown with his Black Sheep nemesis. The climax of this half-century feud came in 1467. Jahan Shah of the Black Sheep, perhaps growing arrogant and complacent in his power, decided to launch a major campaign to crush Uzun Hassan and the White Sheep once and for all. He led his large army into their territory, but Uzun Hassan was the superior general. He avoided a direct pitched battle, using his knowledge of the terrain to harass the Black Sheep army and draw them into a trap in a swift and decisive surprise attack on Jahan Shah's camp. The Black Sheep army was completely routed. Jahan Shah himself was killed while trying to flee the battlefield. The death of their leader shattered the Black Sheep Confederation. Its unity dissolved overnight, and its territories were swiftly swallowed up by the victorious White Sheep. After decades of bloody conflict, the long war was finally over. The banner of the White Sheep now flew unchallenged over western Iran, Iraq, and eastern Anatolia. A new, powerful, and unified Turkmen empire had been forged in the crucible of war, and at its head was Uzun Hassan, one of the most formidable rulers of his age. The stage was now set for the final, brief flowering of this new power. A final act before a completely new and different kind of revolution would rise from the heart of their own domain. With the final defeat of the Black Sheep, Hassan the Tall, or Uzun Hassan, was now the undisputed master of a new and formidable empire. The banner of the White Sheep flew from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of western Iran. His court, which he established in the great city of Tabriz, the old capital of the Mongol Ilkhans, became a center of power and international diplomacy. Uzun Hasan was far more than a simple tribal chieftain. He was a statesman of great vision and ambition, a man who would, for a brief and brilliant moment, make Iran a major player on the world stage. He was the last of the great Turkmen conquerors, and his reign marked the final dramatic chapter in the long age of nomadic supremacy. After crushing his old rivals, Uzun Hasan turned his attention east to the squabbling descendants of Timur, who still ruled in Khorasan. In 1469, he met and decisively defeated the reigning Timurid Sultan Abu Sa'id in battle. With this single victory, he added most of eastern Iran to his domains. For the first time in decades, the eastern and western halves of the Iranian world were united under a single, powerful ruler. Uzun Hasan was now, in effect, the Shah of a restored Persian empire. His power and prestige were now so great that they attracted attention from thousands of miles away, in the capitals of Europe. At this time, the great fear of Christian Europe was the relentless expansion of the Ottoman Empire under its brilliant and ambitious Sultan, Mehmed II, the man who just a few years earlier had conquered Constantinople. The Republic of Venice, a great maritime power whose trade was being choked off by the Ottomans, was desperate for allies. Their gaze fell upon Uzun Hasan, another powerful enemy of the Ottomans, on the other side of their vast empire. And so began one of the most fascinating diplomatic episodes of the 15th century. Envoys from Venice, men like Giosafat Barbaro, undertook the long and perilous journey across the Mediterranean and through hostile territory to reach the court of the White Sheep King in Tabriz. There, they proposed a grand alliance, a plan to crush the Ottoman Sultan between them. Uzun Hasan would attack from the east, while Venice and its European allies would attack by sea and from the west. Uzun Hasan was receptive. He saw the Ottomans as his main rivals for dominance in the region, and was eager for an alliance that might give him a technological edge. The Venetians promised to send not just money and encouragement, but more importantly, firearms, cannons, and the experts who knew how to use them. Encouraged by these promises, Uzun Hasan launched his great war against Sultan Mehmed. In 1472, he led his massive Turkmen cavalry army deep into Ottoman territory in eastern Anatolia. At first, he was successful, winning a number of skirmishes and proving the superiority of his horsemen in mobile warfare. But Sultan Mehmed was a military genius, and he was leading a new kind of army. The core of his force was the Janissaries, an elite corps of infantry armed with handguns and a massive train of field artillery. Uzun Hasan's army, for all its bravery and skill, was a traditional steppe army, its power based on the bow, the lance, and the speed of its horses. It was an army of the past, about to collide with an army of the future. The decisive confrontation came in August 1473 at the Battle of Otluk Beyli. Uzun Hasan, confident in his numbers, launched a massive cavalry charge against the Ottoman lines. The result was a catastrophe. The Ottoman cannons opened fire, tearing horrific gaps in the charging Turkmen ranks. Then, the Janissaries, protected behind a barricade of wagons, unleashed volley after volley of disciplined musket fire. The White Sheep Cavalry, who had never faced such weapons, broke and fled in terror. The battle was a complete and utter rout. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Battle of Otluk is considered a major turning point in military history, demonstrating the decisive superiority of gunpowder armies over traditional steppe cavalry, and marking the beginning of the end for the military system that had dominated the region for centuries. Uzun Hasan managed to escape the battlefield, but his army was shattered, and his aura of invincibility was gone forever. The promised Venetian firearms had never arrived in time. The Grand Alliance was dead. He spent the last few years of his reign a diminished figure, his great ambitions humbled by the roar of Ottoman cannons. When he died in 1478, his empire, which had been built so quickly on the strength of his own personality, began to collapse just as fast. His sons and grandsons immediately fell to fighting one another for the throne, plunging the White Sheep realm into a fatal civil war. Uzun Hasan had been a great ruler, a man who had briefly united a fractured land and made the world take notice. But his reign was a last brilliant flash of a dying ember. His defeat showed that the age of the nomadic horse archer, an age that had begun with the Seljuks 400 years earlier, was over. His empire's swift collapse would create one last power vacuum in medieval Iran, and into that void, a new and revolutionary force, a mystical religious order that had been quietly gathering strength in the heart of his own territory, was about to rise and transform Iran forever. The empire of Uzun Hasan, which had burned so brightly, collapsed into darkness with his death, and his white sheep descendants turned on one another in a ruinous civil war. The land was once again without a master, adrift in a sea of chaos. And in such times, when earthly kings fail and the world seems broken, people often look for a different kind of leader, a leader who promises not just political order, but divine salvation. In the heart of Azerbaijan, in the city of Ardabil, just such a movement had been quietly gathering strength for 2 centuries. An organization that was about to transform from a peaceful, mystical brotherhood into a revolutionary army that would remake Iran in its own image. This movement was the Safaviya, and it had begun life in the late 13th century as a perfectly conventional Sunni Sufi order. Its founder was a holy man of immense charisma and piety named Sheikh Safi al-Din. A Sufi order, or tariqa, is a mystical path within Islam, where a spiritual master, the Sheikh, guides his disciples through prayer, meditation, and devotion toward a more direct, personal, and loving experience of God. For generations, the Safaviya of Ardabil was just that, a respected and peaceful brotherhood. The hereditary sheikhs who succeeded Sheikh Safi were known for their piety, and their lodge in Ardabil became a major pilgrimage site, accumulating vast wealth and lands gifted to it by powerful rulers who saw them as harmless men of God. But in the middle of the 15th century, as the great empires of the Timurids and Black Sheep Turkmens began to crumble, the leadership of the Safaviya passed to a man with a very different vision. His name was Sheikh Junaid. He looked upon the chaos of his time and saw not a disaster, but an opportunity. He was the catalyst who began the radical transformation of the order. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Safaviya order underwent a radical transformation in the 15th century, shifting from a conventional Sunni Sufi brotherhood into a militant, messianic, and heterodox Shia movement. Under Junaid, 2 fundamental changes occurred. First, The theology of the order shifted dramatically. It adopted an extreme, or gulat, form of Shi'ism. His followers began to see him not just as a spiritual guide, but as a divine incarnation, a manifestation of God on earth. This new doctrine created a bond of loyalty that was absolute and fanatical. To die for the Sheikh was to die for God himself. Second, Junaid began to militarize his followers. He preached the importance of holy war, or Gaza, not just as an internal spiritual struggle, but as a literal war against the enemies of the faith. He organized his disciples into a fighting force and led them on raids against the Christian Georgians and Circassians in the Caucasus Mountains to the north. These raids served a dual purpose. They provided booty to enrich the order, and, more importantly, they forged his followers into a disciplined and battle-hardened army. The recruits who flocked to this new, militant banner were the Turkmen tribesmen of Azerbaijan and Anatolia, the very same warrior peoples who formed the backbone of the White Sheep and Black Sheep armies. They were men accustomed to a life of war, but they were now disillusioned with the endless, pointless feuds of their worldly princes. They were drawn to the divine charisma of the Safavid sheikhs, who offered them not just plunder, but a sacred purpose and the promise of salvation. The followers of this new Safavid cause became known by a distinctive name, the Kizilbash, a Turkic word meaning redheads. This came from the unique crimson headgear that was designed for them by Junaid's son and successor, Sheikh Haydar. It was a red cap with 12 gores, or folds, symbolizing their devotion to the 12 imams of mainstream Shia Islam, all wrapped in a white turban. This uniform made them an instantly recognizable and terrifying force on the battlefield. This rising military and religious power in their own backyard deeply alarmed the ruling White Sheep sultans. Uzun Hasan had at first tolerated them, even giving his sister in marriage to Sheikh Junaid. But as the Kizilbash grew in number and their raids became more audacious, conflict became inevitable. In 1460, Sheikh Junaid was killed in battle. Some 30 years later, his son Sheikh Haydar met the same fate. But for their Kizilbash followers, these deaths were not defeats. They were glorious martyrdoms. The blood of their sacred leaders supercharged the movement, giving it a messianic, almost hysterical fervor. They now believed that the heir to the Safavid line, the young son of the martyred Haydar, was a hidden savior who would one day emerge to avenge his father and grandfather and conquer the world in the name of the true faith. The White Sheep rulers, now terrified, began a systematic campaign to hunt down and exterminate the remaining members of the Safavid family. And so, the future of this revolutionary movement now rested on the life of one small boy. His name was Ismail, and he was the new Sheikh of the order. For years, he was hidden, secretly passed from one safe house to another in the cities of Azerbaijan by a small, fiercely loyal band of his Kizilbash guardians, waiting for the day he would be old enough to emerge, rally his red-hatted army, and unleash his holy war upon the world. The White Sheep Empire was a headless beast, thrashing in its death throes as the sons and grandsons of Uzun Hasan tore each other apart for the scraps of a dying kingdom. The land was rife with chaos, and the Turkmen warriors of the Kizilbash, the fanatical redheads, knew their moment was at hand. Their young master, the hidden hope of their messianic faith, was now a boy on the cusp of manhood, kept safe for years by his loyal guardians. In the summer of 1499, the boy, now a charismatic and determined 12-year-old, emerged from his hiding place in the Caspian province of Gilan. His name was Ismail. He sent out the call, and from the mountains of eastern Anatolia and the plains of Azerbaijan, his followers answered. They were the Kizilbash, and they came in their thousands, abandoning their homes and their old allegiances to join the son of their martyred sheikh. They saw him as far more than a mere political leader. He was their Murshid-e-Kamil, their perfect spiritual guide, a semi-divine figure who was destined to avenge his father and grandfather and conquer the world. Their devotion to him was absolute, their courage in his name boundless. They believed him to be invincible, and this belief made them so. With a small but fanatical army of 7,000 of these devoted followers, the boy prophet began his holy war. He was a prodigy of a commander, leading his men from the front with a skill and ferocity that belied his age. His first victories were swift and stunning, and with each city that fell, his legend grew, and his army swelled with new recruits. Finally, in 1501, near a place called Sharur in Azerbaijan, the main White Sheep army, led by their Sultan Alvand, marched to crush this burgeoning rebellion. The Kizilbash were outnumbered by at least 3-1. But on the day of the battle, they fought with a terrifying, otherworldly zeal. Led by their 14-year-old commander, the Redheads charged the larger, less motivated White Sheep force. The raw fanaticism and iron discipline of the Kizilbash shattered the enemy army, which broke and fled in a total rout. The Battle of Sharur was the decisive blow. The last major White Sheep army was gone, and the road to their capital, Tabriz, lay open. Ismail marched into the great city in triumph. There, in the summer of 1501, the boy who had been a hunted fugitive just 2 years earlier placed a crown upon his own head and declared himself Shah of Iran. The Safavid dynasty was born, but Shah Ismail's coronation was accompanied by a second, far more revolutionary proclamation, an act that would change the course of Iranian history forever. Standing before the assembled notables of the city, he declared that the official religion of his new kingdom would be Twelver Shia Islam. This was a stunning and audacious move. For the 9 centuries since the Arab conquest, Iran had been a predominantly Sunni country. While it had deep wells of Shia sentiment and had been ruled by Shia dynasties before, the majority of its people, its institutions, and its religious scholars were Sunni. Now, they were being told to convert. It is a mainstream historical fact that Shah Ismail's declaration of Twelver Shi'ism as the state creed was a pivotal moment that fundamentally reshaped the religious and political identity of Iran, setting it on a different path from its Sunni neighbors and creating the foundations of the modern nation-state. This declaration gave the new Iranian empire a fierce and unique identity, distinguishing it forever from the powerful Sunni Ottoman Empire to its west and the Sunni Uzbeks to its east. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a new age, and a new Iran. The long, chaotic, and brilliant period of medieval Iran, an age that had begun with the fall of one Persian empire, now came to a definitive close with the violent and spectacular birth of another. And so, our long journey through the night comes to its final resting place. We have traveled across nearly 900 years of history, a vast and turbulent ocean of time. We began in the twilight of the Sasanian kings, watching their ancient fire temples grow cold as a new faith arrived from the desert. We saw their descendants struggle to find their place in a new world, patiently preserving the embers of their culture until, in the courts of the Samanids, it could be fanned into a brilliant flame, giving us the immortal soul of a nation in Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. We witnessed the arrival of wave after wave of conquerors, the disciplined Seljuk Turks who built a vast and orderly empire, only to see it crumble into dust. We crept through the mountain fortress of Alamut with the assassins, and felt the earth tremble under the hooves of the Mongol hordes, a storm of fury that left a world in ruins, but was, in the end, itself tamed and absorbed by the patient, powerful civilization it had sought to erase. We saw the terrifying rise of Timur and the delicate, jewel-like art that blossomed in the courts of his children. And we have watched all the chaos of those centuries finally coalesce into the birth of a new kind of Iran, a nation forged in the fire of a boy king's holy war. All of these stories, these names, these empires, now gently recede, leaving behind only their softest echoes: the clash of swords, the whispers of poets, the decrees of kings. They all fade into the quiet murmur of the past, becoming part of the deep and peaceful silence that now cradles you. The long story is over. All that is left to do is drift and to dream.